Welcome to the second day of the International Conference War and Theatre. I mostly stand here to sort of deliver a short update to the schedule. Katja Kobolt will have her lecture at 1 p.m. After that, we'll try to take a reasonably short break. And after that, Djordje Popovic and Damir Arsenijević will give their lectures. Now I'd like to invite Sebastian Horvat to the stage, who will introduce our first two speakers, Gregor and Oxana Timofeeva.
So I will introduce Gregor Moder. So he's partly employed also in our academy. He's teaching philosophy of art. And he's a young or senior researcher in the philosophy department of Senior Research Associate at the Department of Philosophy in Ljubljana. So he recently published a book about Antigone, which is also stepping in the field of theater and of course aesthetics. So for the beginning, I would give myself a short description of 90s, because I mean political, not so political, but also theatrical situation in Ljubljana, in Slovenia. Because in 90s there was, I think, in 1993 there was a theater forum or something like that about the contemporary theater situation in Ljubljana. The guest scholar was also Michel Uyterhoven, and he was really impressed about theater production in Slovenia. He said, "Yeah, how many beautiful performances did you prepare?" And it's you are telling a lot about beauty and formalistic deconstructions and new formations of art. But at the same time, I never felt so far away from Balkan War.
This is what we said yesterday.
Yeah.
I asked
Really?
that question, yes. So
Really?
we are fully aware
So-
of that, yes.
So
This is
this
what I
situation, because
Yeah.
I started my studies in beginning of 90s, and it was really strange that the perspective was not horizontal, but it was actually observing the situation from satellite, from Mars, or from, I don't know, from somewhere very deep. So I still remember the situation in the whole 90s. Actually, if you started anything connected with politics, and especially with Balkan, you were recognized as an idiot, as a person who is not sincerely and deeply connected with art. So nobody, it was a complete disgrace speaking about politics, speaking about war, speaking about East, because we all wanted to be West, capitalistic West. And me as a young person entering into the art, I was immediately instructed that I should develop my own private theater, and that's the only way we could get money. So, okay, if you already spoke about this.
No, we just raised the question, but basically nobody had the answer, so thank you. You gave my, answered my question.
I think that the answer is quite deep, because especially Eda Čufer, she's not here. I think Eda Čufer is a very important person in the field of arts of 90s, and she said that East identified itself with the spoken word. It was a fortress of words. If you wanted to be, and all of us wanted to be West, you have to identify yourself with visual, with visual language. So forget this Stalinistic Eastern Balkan art and politics and go West. And you should go West with pictures, with new media and stuff like this. So that's I think is my point. If you want to be a proper European, don't deal with politics and don't deal with drama, with playwrights. Okay, thank you. Sorry.
So Sebastian, thank you very much for this wonderful introduction and for well, I mean, the introduction was short, which I'm also very happy that it was. You called me young or old, which is very nice. You know, this anecdote that you related, of course, brought immediately, as we've all seen, Lana was immediately there to remind us that this is actually one of the most interesting discussions that we had yesterday. It continued also informally, so this specific question of how does the Slovenian non-responsive kind of way of responding to the war is interesting in itself. And I will myself also be talking to an extent at least, or to a great deal actually, about this. So this will be kind of my contribution towards understanding that. Let me also begin with an anecdote. So we've heard one anecdote from Sebastian. I will also share an anecdote of my own. So we are in the Great Hall of the National Theatre Bucharest in Romania. And it is 19 April 1995. The country, Romania, is still in shock after the events of 1989, which saw the violent suppression of protests in the city of Timișoara and the death of Nicolae Ceausescu and his spouse Elena. The couple held a firm grip over Romania for decades, but were ultimately accused of genocide, among other crimes, by a court-martial and sentenced to an immediate death. The audience members in attendance at the theater in Bucharest were visibly reminded that night, in April 1995, of the power Ceausescu once held over the country. The grand state box, where the couple typically appeared to watch the show, was covered with a curtain. Dignitaries no longer wanted to sit there anyway. It was a seat deliberately left empty. The show scheduled to take place was called Antigone, written by Dusan Jovanović, and performed by the, performed by the ensemble of the Slovenian National Theatre Drama Ljubljana from what used to be the Romania's neighboring country of Yugoslavia. The war in Bosnia was in full swing, and everyone knew that the play's mythical framework, Antigone, was simply an oblique way of addressing the concurrent events. What the audience didn't know, however, was that the show's director, Meta Hočevar, had decided to employ a very special effect. The final scene of the performance was not played out on the stage itself, but in the very state lodge that was supposedly left evacuated. When the curtain over the former Ceausescu box began rising, the audience responded with an audible gasp. The ghost of the dead appeared that night. In a sense, this paper is all about that gasp. For the production of such an effect is the very purpose of theater as a performing art. There is something quintessentially theatrical in the fact that the gasp was not so much about what was actually seen or heard from actors on the stage, but about the lifting of the curtain itself. Something dead and buried was conjured into existence with a single stroke, with the raising of the curtain. And the mythical story that was played out on stage in the multiplicity of living colors turned out to be nothing but a blank canvas for this other scene, played out in the dead gray of the unconscious thought of the people in attendance. In other words, the gasp was audible proof that the performance of Jovanović's Antigone in Bucharest succeeded in producing a kind of fissure, a palpable difference between the apparent, obvious performance on the stage and another performance, one taking place in the timeless present of what may be perhaps referred to as the social unconscious. In this other theater that touches the real traumatic kernel of the social texture, making it palpable for a fleeting moment in time. The point is, of course, that this other staging cannot be apprehended directly. There is nothing to be seen or heard there. Its presence can only be sensed in traces, and its only appearance is the fissure itself, a gasp. What at first appears as something that comes from the outside as a guest performance turns out to have made its home in our very midst. This is, I think, what Oedipus must have felt when it turned out that King Laius's murderer, whom Oedipus has been pursuing, is none other than Oedipus himself. And ultimately, the fact that Jovanović's text refers to war and genocide in Bosnia and evokes the siege of Sarajevo or the siege of Tuzla, it's not clear, by displacing them into a mythical conflict in the archaic past, is not simply a way for the playwright to lend a sense of gravity and an air of importance to contemporary events. This procedure is also clearly not a case of the convention of decorum. It's not an attempt of the dramatist to save the audience from the harm of the real world. Death and destruction were televised daily, sometimes live. In fact, the early 1990s, as Blaž Kavšek reminded me, following CNN's live coverage of American intervention in the Gulf War, significantly redefined war itself as something that takes place live, in the midst of our homes, while we go about our everyday business. And most importantly, the displacement in the mythic past should not be confused for an attempt to depoliticize the war, to forget about the causes and the laws, and to reduce the war to a basic animalistic instinct or to some primordial nature of man. But then, what purpose does this strategic distance serve? I suggest that we read this deliberate displacement, this uprooting of the traumatic event, precisely as the carefully selected way to speak about the horrors of war. Moreover, this hyperbolic distance, not just in the past, but in the mythic past, not Sarajevo or Tuzla, but Thebes. So this hyperbolic distance is there paradoxically not to shield us from the war trauma, but precisely to allow the dramatist to speak about and the audience to engage with something radically intimate and traumatic. So it's a kind of a strategic distance. In the following, I will focus on just one of the three plays that Dušan Jovanović wrote and helped direct in Drama Ljubljana. One of the three plays in the Balkan trilogy, the one on Antigone. But just before, for people who are not familiar with this playwright, let me just briefly go through who Dušan Jovanović was. He was one of the most celebrated playwrights, directors, and theatrical innovators in the Slovenian and to some extent also Yugoslavian cultural space. His Antigone is the first play in the Balkan trilogy, a series of dramatic works dedicated to the war, survival, and exile in the context of the Yugoslav wars in the 1990s. Antigone was followed by The Riddle of Courage. You can guess that it's a reference to Brecht, to Brecht's Mother Courage. And the third one, Who Sings Sisyphus, To everyone who knows Yugoslavian cinematography, you will immediately recognize that this is a reference to Koto Tamo Peva, who's singing over there. Very famous film. Now, the greatest significance of the Balkan trilogy, and here I come to what Sebastian was saying earlier, the greatest significance of the Balkan trilogy lies in the fact that they were produced on the grand stage of Drama Ljubljana, in the main theater hall in the Slovenian capital. In a time when the Slovenian, this is my attempt to give an answer, in a time when the Slovenian political, economic, but also cultural focus was heavily concentrated on strengthening ties with Western Europe and the wider world like South America, Dušan Jovanović was the glaring exemption. And I'm very happy that Zala Dobovšek also talked about Draga Potočnjak's work, who came from a different angle. She did not put it on the grand stage, she used refugees themselves and so on. But Jovanović's difference is that he put it on the grand stage. He truly believed that the Yugoslav wars did indeed intimately concern Slovenia and its citizens, and he was basically the only one who put these wars on the grand stage. Now, the plot of his Antigone loosely follows the events of Euripides's Phoenicians, rather than Sophocles' famous play. The title might therefore be somewhat misleading. The play features an attempted ceasefire between the brothers, Eteocles and Polynices, brokered by their mother Jocasta, and a live duel which ends with both of them dying. This plot, as weaved by Euripides, fits surprisingly well to how the warring sides in Bosnia continue to agree to a ceasefire, usually brokered by some Western European power, only to continue fighting even, quote-unquote, before the ink on the paper was dry. By emphasizing the role of Antigone, the heroine who sacrificed her life to bury her dead brother, the play shifts the focus from war itself to the work of public mourning, the kind of work poets might be best suited to perform. Furthermore, by zooming in on Antigone, the reader and spectator are subtly guided towards the relations of kinship between warring sides, and even to incest. Given that Yugoslavia's official motto was brotherhood and unity, these wars, and especially the war in Bosnia, were perceived by many, especially by those from mixed marriages like Jovanović himself, or with some sort of all Yugoslavian history, as wars among brothers. This excessive emphasis on the kinship between southern Slavic nations in the state of Yugoslavia is perhaps what makes the myth of Antigone all the more appropriate as the drama's backdrop. Now, in the first scene of the play, Antigone feels very uncertain about herself. So I'm talking about Jovanović's Antigone and the first play, the first scene. Antigone makes a pathetic attempt to change the general morose atmosphere, and she's trying to cheer her sister Ismene up by telling her about an incident in a tavern where a man was shot, and the masked person who stole the wallet of the dead man proceeded to ask Antigone for a donation. So Antigone, trying to cheer Ismene up, says, "Madam," he said, "I need your money for humanitarian purposes. Our homeland is suffering." "Well, isn't that funny?" Ismene, "I haven't the slightest sense for patriotic humor." Antigone, grinning, trying to be comical, walking in a funny way. "Aren't I funny?" Ismene, "If I thought you were funny, I would laugh." Antigone, "Then you be funny." Ismene, "Oh, I'm being funny all the time, that's why everyone runs away from me." Antigone laughs forcibly. End of quote. So Antigone is completely out of place. Her forced laughter seems to indicate that she does not know what she's doing, that she's uncertain even about what kind of genre she's supposed to perform in. I take her position here to be precisely that of an artist who feels the duty to engage somehow with a world out of joint, but expects at the same time that anything she can do would be either wrong or meaningless even ludicrous. Now, a very important character in Jovanović's Antigone is the hag, a woman with a very specific position among the city residents. The hag turns out to be the very sphinx once defeated by Oedipus. Her practical role is that of a fortune teller, a role she performs in line with her metaphysical conviction that A, only what was first inside can later come out, and B, that what is inside must come out. So it's a kind of a metaphysics of externalization, you know, the kind of thing that you would expect Luther or Hegel to have an opinion on. Accordingly to her metaphysics, her method of telling the fortune is to examine people's excrement. The hag's methodology is explained in a scene with a young Phoenician woman, a refugee who remains mute throughout most of the play. I'll read that as well. Ismene to the Phoenician. Do you want to know who this lady is, the hag? The Phoenician turns her head towards her, but doesn't speak. She's our Wc-Frau, the keeper of the toilet. Jocasta. The lady collects the admittance fee at the entrance to the public bathroom. Ismene. She's seen so much shit in her life, she really knows shit. Antigone. For a fistful of change, she will also tell you your fortune. Ismene. She's practicing on the toilet. You go to the toilet to poop, you don't draw water, you come out. She goes in, looks at the shit, comes out, tells you your fortune. Hide your shit from her. And so on. What is inside must come out. We could call this the metaphysics of shit, if I may be allowed to borrow this term, taken in all earnestness actually by many scholars. The women do not take the hag very seriously, but from the first scene onward it is clear that Creon is under her influence, that he is her student. In the final scene, after Eteocles and Polynices have already killed each other, the hag completely takes over and overtly gives instructions to Creon. The hag is clearly the main antagonist, I think, in Jovanović's play, not Creon, who is simply dancing to her tunes. She is the Sphinx, but it seems that no one in the play knows the answer to her riddle. How can Polynices win the city without Eteocles losing it, performed as a kind of a quiz show? Her enigmatic appearance, her special relationship with destiny and power, and her charisma all serve to make her a personification of war itself. This is how I read her. Moreover, she seems to embody the idea that war is inevitable, that it was somehow already inside the brothers and simply had to come out. This is actually, I think, the most sensitive question of the play, especially since a common theme in Western journalistic reports about the Yugoslav wars in the 1990s was the idea of an eternal and irrational ethnic conflict within pre-modern Balkan societies. Here I just recall what Blaž was saying last night. It was really convincing. Is Jovanović subscribing to this simplistic, exoticizing, condescending narrative? Moreover, is Jovanović suggesting that war is simply an integral part of the human condition and that there is perhaps no good reason to seek specific perpetrators of specific crimes, to discuss how inflammatory propaganda was manufactured, who contributed the ideological grounding for warmongering, who made great profit in time of war and suffering? I'm thinking Janša here. I have to think Janša specifically. Who made great profit in time of war and suffering, to analyze historical causes of war and so on. Now, of course, we cannot expect of a playwright to perform the task of a prosecutor in a court of justice, of a journalist, or of a historian. Still, by focusing on senseless violence and hatred, exemplified especially in Eteocles and Polynices, who keep on fighting even after their death in Jovanović's play. It seems that the text of Jovanović's Antigone at times walks dangerously close to falling into the trap of essentializing the condition of war. The reason I think the play ultimately avoids falling in this trap is that it is really the character of the hag who personifies the reductionist theory of an inner necessity of war that was destined to come out. The hag, being cast as the riddle-posing monster and a warmonger, certainly does not represent the truth of the play. So, just a philosophical comment, this would be some kind of like a bad Hegelianism that would see some sort of eternal necessity to come out as war that we have been witnessing. That would be a kind of a bad Hegelianism. But although the hag is not emblematic of the play as such, neither is Antigone. In the final dialogue with Creon, Jovanović has Antigone say the famous lines from Sophocles' text, namely that she lives not to hate, but to love. However, these words are drained of any significance, and not just because the antagonism between her and Creon, so crucial for Sophocles, is of little importance in Jovanović's play. It is the dualism of love and hate that is consistently rendered meaningless throughout the play. Jovanović's Polynices embodies the vacuousness of this dualism. It is revealed that as a schoolboy, Polynices was a great lover. He wrote a poem in the 5th grade about how to love everyone, even his enemies, and especially declares his love for both Antigone and for his brother. It seems that what was inside Polynices in his childhood was an abundance of love, but what came out of Polynices was pure, unfiltered hatred. In Jovanović's version, Antigone and Polynices are sibling lovers. Polynices' hatred becomes pure in a very special scene in which Antigone talks to her already dead brother. This is a very interesting scene. If you're interested in Antigone in all different kinds of versions, I think this is where Jovanović makes his special contribution to this line. So her side of the dialogue is romantic, as she expresses her naive love for her brother and how she imagines them as some sort of Romeo and Juliet. It's pretty long, I'll not read the whole thing, but it goes something like this. When I was little, I wished I was dead. Not really, of course, just seemingly, and just temporarily. Just that so everyone would believe I was dead, and they would come to the grave, and they would cry, and they would say how much they loved me. It's really silly, right? And she ends by saying, then I would have risen from my coffin and would have spun merrily in my black burial dress and varnished paper-soled shoes, and would have said, oh, Polynices, I have only just dozed off. Sorry, I had to perform this. To this, the dead Polynices responds, but I have one thing to say to you before I shut up for good. So he's already dead and he's saying this. Deep down, I despise your disinfected, colorless regard of a perfumed coward. I despise your impersonal peacemaking weaving of some ill-conceived plan to resolve the dispute between us in a peaceful manner. Gets super angry. There is no peaceful way. No, I want it, he wants it. I don't give it, he doesn't give it. Bullet to the head. Where do you see any peace? We're two people who are mutually exclusive, passionately, who are destined to kill each other. And so we are destined to disappear from the face of the earth. The Phoenician starts singing. She sings a gentle song of the sun, the beauty, the love, while Polynices is suffocating in his swan song of hatred. It was worth living just to let ourselves loose. We hated with our deeds, not with our verses. And I am not sorry to have died of hatred, speaking blissfully as in orgasm. Sister, for what I have died, I would want to die again 100 times. Okay, this final line of this crescendo of hatred strikes a Slovenian reader to the heart. It's a paraphrase of a well-known, of actually a really beautiful poem by Karel de Stonica Juh, a partisan poet, who during World War II wrote a poem dedicated to the mother of the fallen partisan. So what do you say to the mother of the fallen partisan? And the final line of Kayuh's poem is given to the dead boy, to the dead partisan, young partisan. And the young partisan says, in my translation, Life is beautiful, Mama. Life is beautiful. But what I died for, I would want to die for again. So it's really a beautiful sentence. In Jovanović's paraphrase, this wonderful line becomes utterly grotesque. Polynices has no noble cause to fight for his brother. The fight is not even about Thebes for him. It's an indulgence in pure, unrestrained hatred. The Phoenician song of love and beauty in the background only emphasizes the pure hatred in the foreground. But singing songs about love and beauty does not absolve one from evil. There's a line. Jovanović has a problem with this Southern Slavic proverb. Ko peva zlo ne misli. It's absolutely they can and do. The naivety of Antigone's solution to simply not wage war cannot be denied. Creon's pragmatism wins, even though this victory is itself meaningless. Now, in the ancient Sophoclean version of Antigone, there is a curious passage from the heroine's final speech, just before she is led away to be buried alive. She declares, Antigone in Sophocles, that she would not have risked her life to bury her dead husband's body if she had been wed, or of her child had she been a mother. She is only risking her life for her brother. And many commentators of Sophocles' text have suggested that the excessive devotion to Polynices was perhaps due to her romantic, incestuous feelings for him, even though Sophocles' text does not explicitly evoke incest. Now, in Jovanović's version of Antigone, incest is not only explicit, it is omnipresent. In Meta Hočevar's staging, there's actually two couples of lover siblings, not just Antigone and Polynices, but also Ismene and Eteocles. And they have sex on stage. I'm not sure because I haven't seen, was it before one of the brothers were dead or after the brothers were dead? I'll have to double check this, but they have sex on stage. One actually wonders about the third pair of siblings, about Creon and Jocasta. Anyway, the relationships are quite explicit, even vulgar. And there is incest even in the relationship between the brothers. When the brothers duel, which is performed very interestingly, as a kind of a live reportage, Eteocles rapes Polynices. Oh yeah, this is the sex scene. I think the brothers may have been dead because there's dirt on his hands. Anyway, this is the duel. Eteocles. In this very moment, Eteocles notices the white flesh on the naked buttocks of his enemy and his masculine muscle begins to pulsate. The Phoenician begins to let out terrified screams. Polynices. They are rolling on the floor in terrible convulsions. Eteocles. He's going to ram him! He shoved his candle-straight limb into his brother's colon. The Phoenician screams full of pain, cut like knives. The Phoenician, who is an innocent bystander, caught up in the war, was perhaps herself a victim of rape, as is hinted in the hag's casual remark that the Phoenician is pregnant. Or perhaps the Phoenician is carrying Polynices' baby, a metaphor of his capacity to love. There's a scene where she recites his childhood poem written in the 5th grade in the final scene. If there is anyone in the play who has even the slightest chance of outliving the hag's spell, anyone who carries the possibility of a different future, anyone who can solve the riddle of war and break through the destiny of the brothers to endlessly repeat the cycle of incest and violence, it is the Phoenician. She's the only one who poses any threat to Hag, as slight and minimal as it is. This seems to be, to me, to be the meaning of the final scene, where Hag, or Sphinx, is in full control and in a matter-of-factly way, takes control and then saves her final lines to prophesize the destiny of the 3 women. So the Hag declares that Antigone and Ismene, who had sex with their dead brothers, are pregnant, apparently condemning Thebes to continue the cycle of incest and war. definition, who can perhaps be read as the beacon of hope, however, is not pregnant. Or perhaps the hag will make sure that she doesn't carry to term. The way I read it, it's really contextual. The play's production was in 1993, when the war in Bosnia was still escalating. And the final scene, it seems to me, simply reflects this dark time that dared not to hope. I will conclude now. I just have one more remark, one more page. I want to come back to the topic of the interplay of distance from and proximity to the traumatic experience of war, or loss in general. This is explicitly the topic of the second play of the trilogy, of The Riddle of Courage, which I cut from this presentation. But I suppose that an element of this interplay of distance and proximity in Antigone, you can see it in Antigone's uncertainty at the beginning of her play. Her forced laughter, her performance of silly walking indicates a wider uncertainty about what it means to perform in the context of war. There doesn't seem to be a clear distinction between the performance and the war itself. I think this is a point that Zala was also touching in her presentation yesterday. That how do you separate from performance of war and war itself? And obviously, the choice of Brecht's piece is here quite indicative, because Brecht obviously wants us to make a huge distance. Now, in The Riddle of Courage, Jovanović's text, this becomes the central problem of the play, where a theatrical troupe is rehearsing for a production of Brecht's Mother Courage. So we have theatrical troupe on stage, staging Brecht's Mother Courage. The main character, Irena, was played by Milena Zupancic. The main character's problem is that she cannot play the part of Anna Fierling, because she cannot distinguish between the representation of trauma and trauma itself, between loss and its performance. But what if, and I put this as a question, not as a claim, but what if that is the problem of social trauma as such? What if the nature of traumatic experience, at least as perceived on a social plane, is such that it can never be observed or talked about in its immediacy, but that the thing itself becomes inseparable from how it is represented or how it is talked about? This, I argue, is the wager of theatre, that theatrical representation is not merely an indirect reference to the fissure that it represents, the fissures such as war trauma, but that by representing it, it has the power to conjure it somehow in its immediacy, to produce it in its actuality, to elicit an audible gasp. In other words, that representation is in fact presentation. Now, in response to this, one can always assert that such thoughts are nothing but fantasy. But at the same time, one cannot deny that theatre, at least in very specific circumstances, indeed has the capacity to produce something real, to unearth something dead, in the very act of burying it with the veil of theatrical performance. Perhaps it is for this very reason that... Sorry, what happened? You clapped? Oh, I like these sentences. Perhaps it is for this very reason that when we think about historical events, we cannot but think about them in theatrical terms. Whether it is a land or naval battle, a coronation or other such investiture, or even a revolution as described by Marx in the beginning of 18th Brumaire. This thought, if we are allowed to pursue it, implies a strange reversal of time, such that the representation of an event, which, in the accepted understanding of how time functions, can only happen after the fact, that the representation of an event intervenes with that event itself, becomes part of it, and even seems to engender it. Thank you very much. This is from Mother Courage. I'm sorry if this was a bit long. I had to cut it last night, so Sebastian, are you still here?
Yeah.
Ah, okay. So, did you want to open the floor for questions?
Yes. I would like to open the floor for questions. So, go ahead.
A quick clarifying question, but I was looking more substantial questions.
I
take care of the mic. Sorry.
It's working.
So a quick clarifying question when we're waiting for a more substantial one. Why is the character of the Hague, why is she a Sphinx and not a Tiresias?
Mm-hmm.
Right?
There's no Tiresias. That's a very interesting point. Actually, I thank you for this, because I wasn't... Yeah, there's no Tiresias. Which is also quite significant. And it's my ambition, like I didn't think about it. Oh, I feel bad now. Okay, there's no Tiresias, which is important, yeah. The Sphinx, I think, symbolizes, the monster that had to be defeated in order for Thebes to be saved. So the only way to save Thebes is to defeat the Sphinx, but it seems that Sphinx takes over.
Right, but Sphinx is the presentation, right? And Tiresias, through his soothsaying, is representation. It's one way to solve the riddle. It's the bad Hegelian, like you say, poor Hegelian way of solving it. It's exactly the way we don't want to solve it. So that's why, just listening to you, I thought, oh, she's Tiresias.
Yeah, no, you're right. I mean, there's obviously the omission of Tiresias. There is that, and I didn't comment on it because I didn't see him and I didn't miss him. Very stupid of me.
Miss what you don't see.
Yeah, I should, I guess. Lana?
I would like to proceed also with my question that I was opening yesterday, and then Sebastian greatly, somehow, intuitively forward this debate, and also after this your presentation, thank you Gregor for that. I wanted to also to challenge you in a way, maybe to think further about what happened in that time, because the topic of the conference is theater and war, and somehow to understand, because you were also emphasizing that Dušan Jovanović was very well known, established theater director and writer. He was probably Yugo-nostalgic as well, and for him also personally, the dissolution of Yugoslavia was something terribly going on. So he had some impulse, also artistic impulse to react. So he reacted with Balkan trilogy. He had this position to present it in, as you said, very established institution, drama, Ljubljana. So how it is possible that this situation did not have some bigger impact, let's say, on the audience, because yesterday we were talking, oh, you present something and people just come, to drink, to have fun, and nothing basically changed in the audience. But how about that? This is institutional theater with a great impact. Did something changed in the people who came there to see serious piece of shit? In the situation, when something serious is going on. As Sebastian said, nobody reacted, everybody wants to be very polite, new capitalist products, very Western oriented to be cool, nobody wants to have dirty hands with dirty war is going on, something, savages are taking care of each other. So basically, how it is possible, or maybe not, I don't know, that this impact basically, this Balkan trilogy changed something in the people in Slovenia, understanding better maybe what is going on, or understanding their own position within this situation. And I just want, this is the question, I just want to add one comment. Because you mentioned only Janša about war profiteers.
Yeah, it is.
I always have the impulse to react because, the erasure, which happened as one of the first consequences of the Slovenian independence, which affected the lives of 100,000 people of
20,000. It's okay.
20,000, yeah, thank you. 20,000 people in Slovenia was executed not by any right wing, but basically by the new government of Slovenia, which was constituted from the Communist Party of Slovenia, basically changed.
No, I don't think that's the case. It
Okay.
was executed by Demos, who won,
Yes,
the election.
but these people were before in the Communist Party of Slovenia.
No, let's if
Okay.
you'll allow me to answer your
Okay,
questions, because
good.
you know, just so that we
We
don't
can
have
speak
just
about
one
that later,
question.
okay,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
the question was question. Okay,
Yeah, yeah.
thank you.
So, yeah, the facts, I think you need to double check. But your question about the Slovenian, because I do think that that's a really good question, and I mentioned yesterday that this is something that I was also talking in correspondence with Branislav Kobolt. This is what Sebastian and myself were discussing the other night when we had beers here. So it is a huge question. So, you know, why the lack of reaction? And I'm the kind of theorists that do not care about the personal reasons. So I don't care, not that I don't know, I don't care about personal reasons that Dusan Jovanović had or didn't have for his reasons to engage. I can only speak as to what effect this had. And first of all, yes, it was a great exception. Second of all, the Antigone, like the other two plays weren't so successful. But Antigone was successful. First of all, it was produced not only by Drama, but also by this Austrian Wiener Festival. It was performed in Theater an der Wien, so it was kind of, which is now a opera place, but at the time was a place for modern theater. So it was successful. It did, like the play itself won the national reward for a good text. And it is a good text, I think. I hope I show this tonight. It's, you know, it has humor, it has rape between brothers. I mean, it has everything a good play should have, I think. So I think the reception was really good, even though the critical reception wasn't quite as I mean, there was mixed reviews. I've read some reviews, and Simon Kradum, the ex head boss of this institution, was, you know, felt it was the success was or the play itself was mediocre. I don't know. It was successful, and it was a glaring exemption. But I mean, we can only just come back to the basic question. Even for me personally, I was, you know, I was a kid of 12 to 14 years old. I was, you know, I was always on television. I was reading newspapers. I was personally very involved with the war. But I was also, at the same time, the kind of person that would say, "Why, you know, you are an idiot to get involved." You know, at the same time, I was stuck to the monitor. I was thinking in my head all the time about it. But I would also suggest, you know, if you want to do business, if you want to have life, if you want to enjoy Coca-Cola, just enjoy Coca-Cola. Don't go enjoying Sarajevo. This is something that we've, you know, one of the famous images that brought war to me, to my home, was when Mladina published this wonderful set of postcards from Sarajevo, basically. And one that was really effective was modeled on "Enjoy Coca-Cola" slogan, but it just said "Enjoy Sarajevo." And I think it's a really good way of how everyone wanted to enjoy Coca-Cola. And I think it was just the idiots who were enjoying Sarajevo. This is my answer. Mladen?
Yes, Gregor, thank you. That was great.
Okay, I was worried because I mentioned the psychoanalytic concept. And I thought, okay, Mladen is going to just kill me now.
No, absolutely not. I was just wondering, you mentioned this widespread theory in the West, that in the Balkans you have these tribes who are bloodthirsty and killing each other. This is a specific, whatever, it's in the genes. And you have the Western look upon all the situation, which is completely disaffected, and wants to take care of this. Now, this myth of the Balkan tribes, do you think Dusan Ivanović actually deconstructs in this play or adds to it in some sense? Because with all the incest, the combination of incest and war, he actually makes it even worse than the myth, the Western myth was. So how do you think that does he take a distance to this myth, or does he contribute actually to spreading this myth?
Yeah, that is the question, if I may. I'm sorry, I just can't get on. Right, but that is definitely the question. I mean, I myself I did mention it briefly in this text, that I myself really feel that at moments, Jovanović's text can be read as simply, reflecting this myth of, endless genocides, whatever, endless violence of, just pure idiotic hatred, no reason actually even for it. Enjoyment in hatred as such. Again, my reasons why I think that eventually the text avoids that trap is that, first of all, it's really the hag who has this metaphysics of externalization, in the sense of, shit comes out. So the bad Hegelian sort of approach to what produced war, because it was already in there. It's really the hag, and hag I do not think is the good guy. Is not the good guy, is also not Teiresias, in the sense of the bearer of the truth. Is the opposite of Teiresias. So I totally acknowledge, and I when I was reading it, I think it's the problematic part of the play, perhaps, because it's maybe not clear enough that he's criticizing this. But I do think that in the end he is criticizing it, so that he is trying to say it's not that simple. And I think another thing that confirms this is the idiocy of Antigone at the same time. I think Antigone also is a kind of a Slovenian in the play, in the sense that, oh, hey, let's make love, not war. It's kind of like stupid. She doesn't know what to do. Basically, she's the Slovenian in a sense, Let's just not. And it's an idiotic response. So he doesn't give solutions, but I think he problematizes the obvious answer that was spread around in the Western media. That's my answer.
To be sure, I think the play can be redeemed, yes, in this sense.
Yeah, okay.
It's deeply ambiguous, but I think in the end, yes.
I agree. Okay.
Because in the same times, Dusan Jovanović wrote this text about Balkan War, Goran Stefanovski wrote Bacchanalia. And this is a specific representation of the problematic Western view of the Balkan situation. So you have the conflict between Pentheus and Dionysus. So Pentei wants to bring Western values to the Balkan, and Dionysus is fighting against him. And it's really this scheme of Western representation of Balkanic problem. And I know that Dusan was a little bit frustrated with this ideological scheme, but at the same time he participated in it. But I also agree that Antigone is deeply
ambiguous. Ambivalent.
Yeah, so ambivalent. But as I remember, the critical response to the, not so much to Antigone, but also to all three performances was not great. Mildly said. It was really the whole Slovenian theater wanted to bring this to the outskirt. All three plays. The plays, as I remember, because the Antigone was something what I remember, because I started at the academy with my studies. at the same time, and I remember the play was producing this uncomfortable situation among the audience, not something you could call revelation, or this is good or this is bad, but let's put it aside. So it was not a success. I mean, in this theatrical
it was
sense.
a great success in Vienna, which maybe adds to this.
Yes.
This reinforces the rest of the Balkan tribes.
Thank you for these comments. If there's nothing immediate more, sorry to usurp your role, Sebastian, but today's schedule is a bit tougher than yesterday, so maybe we can make a short recess and then continue with Oksana.
Okay.
So let's I'll just finish this up. Let's give a warm applause for Gregor.
Okay, so welcome back. My name is Tanja Petrović, and I'm going to moderate the next 3 presentations. The first one is by Katja Kobolt, my colleague from the Institute of Cultural and Memory Studies at Research Center of the Slovenian Academy of Sciences and Arts. In Ljubljana, Katja is a scholar of comparative literature and cultural studies, and also a curator. Her research interests have focused on critical, especially feminist interventions in processes of memorialization, historicization, and institutionalization. She is currently a Marie Curie Fellow at our institute, where she researches women illustrators of children's books in socialist Yugoslavia and conditions of production of these illustrations and children literature in general. She pays particular attention to infrastructural issues and concepts of childhood, family, social reproduction, aesthetic education, and subjectification, as well as their social embeddedness in different Yugoslav temporalities and spaces. Today, Katja will stay in the realm of children literature, but we will have also perspective of migration induced by war and violence, and the title of her talk is The Little Prince Defies Silence, Literary Agency After Migration. Ismet Berkić, Simo Ešić, Valerija Skrinjar-Tvrs. Katja, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this invitation, for which I was very much looking for to join thinking, but unfortunately due to different force majeure factors, I was hindered to join you as extensively as I hoped for. I was especially, this invitation by Gregor and Blaž basically encouraged me to take a look of the material that Tanja already mentioned, which is my research into artistic and especially artistic work for children in the realm of socialist Yugoslav children's literature. And as Blaž and Gregor approached me with their invitation, this of course gave me an insight and encouraged a look towards the work of several authors that due to war in Bosnia and Herzegovina came as refugees to Slovenia and also Germany. In this sense, basically with my research within MOJ DOM project, I pay attention to basically very neglected part of literature and literary and art history in Slovenian context. Thus, I was basically trying to map the structures and the relations of productions with which authors and artists continued their work even when they were refugees. And I especially looked to the works that they produced together with children. Thus I was reading stories and poems by children in which they were describing and reflecting the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina and their refugee everyday. And with that, they tackled quite a lot of aspects that are not only characteristic to the memory of these wars, but also the ways that artistic and literary production by people that migrated still face today. Children under 16 years of age represented almost half of, at that time, approximately 80,000 refugees from Bosnia and Herzegovina in the 90s in Slovenia, but also elsewhere, where children, especially during the war, like the most represented group. And similarly, as only 1/10 of all refugees were institutionally housed, and the majority stayed with relatives, friends, and colleagues. This was also the case with literary and artistic work. The writers and artists were mainly self-organized in their work, but they were also supported by some of their Slovenian colleagues and also by selected infrastructure. The so-called immigrant writers and artists are rarely dealt with in the framework of the Slovenian literary and artistic discourses and also structures. This is mainly due to the monocultural and mononational orientation of both Slovene literature and other artistic systems and their structures. As we know from feminism, exclusion always relies on structures through which it is enacted. The ways in which the Slovenian literary and artistic policy systems prevent the integration of immigrant writers and artists is the focus of the research of some of our colleagues with Tanya, mainly located at the Slovenian Migration Institute at our home institution. And acknowledging the multiple narrations and the structures which prevent integration of immigrant writers and artists into literary and artistic system here in Slovenia. It's very important work, and this is where our colleagues have done the work. I, on the other side, in my research, focused on doing, on work and on agency. This is on the ways in which the writers and the artists manage to continue their work for and with children. Why is agency important? Especially in situations when people migrate or are refugees. If people are to build new life and new home, possibilities of meaningful work in which they are good in, to express themselves is of crucial importance, not only for their integration into new society, but for the so-called host society as well. If the host society is to develop, it needs to enable and hear also the voices and doings of those who come. So, as Tanya mentioned, I particularly departed from several artists and writers. These were Ismet Bekrić, who was born in 1943, canonized children's author in Bosnia and Herzegovina, longtime editor in Banja Luka, where he also edited children's edition. He was also very active in cultural, political, and publishing political structures at the time of Yugoslavia. Šimo Ešić and Ismet Bekrić migrated to Slovenia, to Ilirska Bistrica, where he still today lives. Šimo Ešić, again, children's poet, editor and publisher, who migrated to Germany, where he already in '91 published a publishing house, Bosanska Riječ. Ismar Mujezinović, an artist who is most known, I guess, to people from the region, as he designed the posters for the Sarajevo Olympics, and also posters for very famous movies like Walter brani Sarajevo and Sjećaš li se doli Bel. And Varelia Skriniar-Tvrs, who was born in 1928 in Slovin Zagorje, was a partisan teacher, and after the war basically went into the political education of Osvobodilna Fronta in Slovenia and continued her work as a journalist. And she was based in Sarajevo for almost 40 years, where she was a member of the editorial board of Male Novine, a journal for children, which had a very huge print run, as it was used also in the education process for Serbo-Croatian language, so all over the republics. And Valeria Skriniar-Tvrs was basically among these four people the one who was already before the war the most translated into Slovenian language, and who also, due to the fact that she also produced her work in Slovenian language, was the most integrated into publishing system, but still her work has been very much neglected from the professional public. So starting from the conversations with these authors, and also other interviews with them, as well as with conversations with children that were part of the workshops that these authors and other artists organized, and that are today adult, and that talk to other researchers in the project. It happened just next to us, zgodilo se čisto blizu nas, which was a project by Vodnikova Domaćija 2 years ago, with which Vodnikova Domaćija commemorated 20 years of arrival of Bosnian Herzegovinian refugees to Slovenia. I was looking for the ways which enabled and the ways their literary and artistic agency was structured. Just as writers and artists in their work for and with children while they were refugees, and also later on, could attach on the modes of literary and artistic agency and education that was developed in the socialist Yugoslavia, I also, with my current research, I draw on my previous work on the so-called literary agency. In this sense, I continue to outline the literary agency, which I have by now drawn from the discourses, conceptualizations, policies, practices, and infrastructures. and its role in the establishment of literary policy system in socialist Yugoslavia and later. So also basically the look on what these actors were doing while they were refugees also shed some insights to some of the continuities of literary systems from Yugoslavia and that they continued within the Slovenian national framework later. I basically developed the literary agency or the concept of literary agency in basically aligning to two different concepts. One is of Roman philologist of Roman languages, Doris Zomer, who together with her colleagues was researching cultural politics and activities within Latin American leftist movements. And they coined the concept of cultural agency in reference to Gramscian passive revolution and consensual hegemony, which requires compromise and a new culture that counts everybody in. And I propose a somehow narrower concept of literary and artistic agency as a generative and reproductive lever for the development and renewal of literary and artistic systems, as well as subjectification and action that goes beyond the field of literature and art. I look at the professional biographies of these selected artists. I take into account the professional reception of their work, especially within Slovene and German context. And I further, based on interviews with them and children, try to grasp the literary and artistic agency in reference to narrative agency, but this I will do in the conclusion. For now, for the time being, enough of theory, and let us have a look of what kind of activities were these writers and artists who were refugees themselves pursuing with refugee children. Looking back into the situation of the 1990s, to which the people were fleeing from war in Bosnia and Herzegovina and came to Slovenia. Just as today, I mean, as you know, in refugees' language, books are seldomly found, as refugees mostly take with really only the necessary documents and the necessary equipment while they are fleeing. As it is important today, it was also important at that time, fleeing from Sarajevo or from Bosnia. Basically, people took with only what they could carry. And the situation in Slovenia, even though Slovenia and Slovene literary system was integrated into Yugoslav system, it was still very much mono-nationally orientated, especially then after 1991. Children could not find works for them, children books on shelves of public libraries or school libraries, and this gap basically were then filling publications like this. Biblioteka Exile ABC that were published within the Kulturni vikendjece iz Bih at Vodnikova Domačija, here only a block away from where we are now. And books like this by Bosanska Riječ, the publishing house in Wuppertal, co-established by Šimo Esić. And in one of these publications, Sonja Ivić, who was born in 76 and who fled Sarajevo on her own. She was wounded in Sarajevo. Later on, she also lost her father. In one of these stories, she also wrote the story Čovjek, in which she basically tackles one effect which still is characteristic of the memory of the wars of people that in one way or another experienced this war, and this is the divide between those who stayed in the war situation in Bosnia and Herzegovina and those who went to become the refugees. And it's basically the effect of the difficulties that refugee children, a lot of them being alone without parents in these situations, were facing, had from a moral point of view, they were less painful than the experiences of their friends that stayed in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and basically the difficulties how to come to terms, to acknowledge one's own trauma, without putting the trauma of the other in the shadow. You can read, I won't read, or maybe I read with you just to get the feeling of what the children were writing. The methods in their workshop were that sometimes the topics were suggested by the mentors. Sometimes they were writing on free topics, so this story, it's called Čovjek. Previše toga smo skupa preživjeli i previše se vezali da bi se sve to moglo prekinuti. Ali ipak, nemam dovoljno snage da im napišem pismo, jer znam da bih napisala kako je teško biti sam negdje daleko. Imam li ja pravo to napisati? Dok sam ja slušala šum mora, oni su slušali zvižduk metaka. Dok sam ja upoznavala ljepote Italije, oni su upoznavali svaki kutak podruma, tražeći neko bolje sklonište. Imaju li pravo osuditi me i mogu li ja osuditi sama sebe i osjećati se krivom za ono što nisam učinila? Zašto se osjećam kao izdajica, kad bi i oni učinili isto? Da su tog hladnog 20. novembra imali šansu za spas od ludila i smrti. I opet se pitam, imam li pravo reći da mi je teško i mogu li se ikada i ikako uporediti sa njima? Oni su zajedno, a ja sam sama. Oni će uvijek moći proći izdignute glave, svima pogledati u oči i reći, mi smo se borili i mi smo izdržali. A vi, gdje ste bili vi? Neću ih smjeti pogledati, iako sam se i ja borila. Olovka i papir su sredstva borbe, nas koji smo silom prilika napustili sve i sada se nalazimo izgubljeni negdje između dva svijeta, dva života, ne razlikujući javu od sna i san od jave. Gdje je naša stvarnost? Šta je stvarnost? Ranije nisam znala, a sada znam još manje. Da li je to ono u čemu živiš ili ono u čemu razmišljaš? Čemu se nadaš? Ja sam negdje između. Together with other stories by Sonja Ivić about the experiences of war as refugee, this story was published in an edition of 200 copies under the title Krvarim ili živim, I'm bleeding but I'm alive, in this biblioteka in 1995. The book edition was, Biblioteka Exile ABC, was published between 1993 and 1996 as a part of Kulturni vikend djece iz BiH, and was founded by the poet, translator and editor Josip Osti, who passed away 3 years ago in Slovenia, and who was among of the few that kind of managed to become integrated into Slovenian literary system, mainly due to the fact that he started to write in Slovenian language. The small black and white, I can pass them. Just have a look of the booklets. There are many of them. They were as the Kulturni vikend djece itself, mainly financed by the Open Society Fund. The Open Society Fund provided also little fees for the mentors who were working with children. Their children were basically coming from all over Slovenia. They were housed whether in zbirni centri or with relatives. The books themselves were also partly funded by some of Slovenian artists and literates that supported this initiative. And Josip Osti described this book edition as that they were war editions. Of literature works published in Bosnia and Herzegovina, as well as books by Bosnian and Herzegovinian writers who lived in Bosnia, in Slovenia, or elsewhere, as well as translated Slovene literature. As you see here on the book text, Osti suggested the readers to whom the books were given free of charge, also to give them to others. He encouraged the readers, if they have the possibility, to photocopy them themselves and to share them with other interested persons. In the framework of the Kulturni vikend djece iz BiH were working also other artisans, musicians with children. I think it's important that I just mention their names, as they are partly, they're largely forgotten. The father of this idea and initiator of this Kulturni vikend djece BiH was musician and pedagogue Vjekoslav Andrej, who together with his wife, also musician Marija Andrej, and their daughter Vesna Andrej Zaimović, was teaching music. Other musicians that were working with children were Sabrija Džafić, Djordje Busančić, Meira Ismailović, and Maja Muslimović. She was mentoring children's corps called named Bombončići. Marina Andrej was leading the animation course. Anton Bartulović, the father of Alenka Bartulović, anthropologist, Slovenian anthropologist, was leading copper crafts. And the art workshop was led by Ismar Muezinović, whom I already mentioned, a renowned painter, son of very renowned Bosnian-Herzegovinian painter Ismet Muezinović, who worked also as designer, illustrator, set designer, and later on writer, filmmaker, and musician. Ismet Muezinović recalls he was invited to lead this workshop by Vjekoslav Andrej, and he recalls that the workshops were intended to make the difficult period of refugeehood at least a little bit easier for the children, and to give them a better perspective for the future, as well as to rebuild trust in people by working together and socializing within the workshops. They also, with their work stand, they used the works for children to accompany the publications by Kulturni vikend Djece Bih. And Muezinović says that he welcomed all the children at the workshop, regardless their so-called talent, as long as they had desired to create. He was guided more by the desire to impart knowledge and skills that would help children in their studies and career options and aspirations, as drawing and art design is an element of a wide variety of works such as architecture, film, theater, and set design. And children of different ages were faced with the same task and techniques, which, according to Muezinović, motivated the younger children and obliged the older ones to pay action to problems such as proportion, scale, foreshortening, and perspective. The mentors also jointly work. Thus, I want to share with you now just a few minutes of a video presentation of Kulturni vikend Djece Bih, and a short animation film that was done in a joint work by children in different workshops. Amamo. short animation.
Odlasci, rastanci. A tamo nema kiša kao ovdje. Volim miris kiše ovog grada. A treba sama, bez njega, bez kiša.
Mala. Gotovo, sve smo spremili. Bit ćeš tu, mala. Svaki put kad mi se u nozdrve uvuče miris asfalta posle kiša. Tvojih kiša.
I already mentioned that not only what these artists and authors were doing together with children, also their follow-up work has been very rarely basically paid attention to. What I mean, apart from sketching the infrastructures and structures which enabled these authors and artists their more or less continuous works, and which again gives some insights into the functioning of the institutions of art and literary system in Slovenia. I try to basically grasp their literary and artistic agency with the help of import of concepts that have been developed within narrative, hermeneutic, narratology, and I will just now, in a conclusion, sketch these different aspects. A narrative agency has within the research basically been used to grasp and explore the ways in which different narratives affect the subjective or the collective constitution of reality and the sense-making as a complicated relation between ethical and the ontological. The concept of narrative agency is meant to reveal the roles of culturally mediated narratives of self-interpretations in becoming a subject capable of agency. And the three central dimensions of it are awareness of different perspectives and of the cultural repertoire of the narrative that circulate, and of our cultural environment that provide us with models of self-making. And in this sense, I map toward extending also toward the structures that enabled this agency, and I tackle basically what these authors brought with, which methods and which ideas of literary and artistic educations they were attaching to, and they were also, they're very evident also in the works by children, and how they also expand this towards the new situation. Second is the imagination, the capacity to imagine beyond what it appears to be self-evident in the present, and to critically engage with culturally available repertoire and the structures, and to critically expand the waves of what is possible in terms of structures and in terms of doing. And the third aspect is the dialogicality, which is the capacity to enter into the relationships and be part of communities that have their own shared in-between narratives, and also in-between structures, that is intersubjective mythologies and narrative sense-making systems, and to participate in the renewal and challenging and transformations. And I hope that and believe that by really integrating and insisting on also these quite spontaneous and self-organized also structures, and what came out of this work, we can expand also the literary and artistic agency, as we know, especially in the current situation in which it's this mononational levers of exclusion are parted with very with neoliberal and very result-orientated, basically cultural politics. That this is a pointed point of entry also to insisting on different modes of production, which is also production in languages that are not Slovenian, but are spoken by children and by artists and authors in our production context. And there are several of basically then also attachment points. There are works of our colleagues at ZRC who are developing also different models for intercultural opening, as basically, especially literary system has the most interest within the educational systems, and there are many possibilities to integrate authors and artists that live here and that produce and also that the educational programs get alive in terms of that they have vivid attachment to the artistic and literary production today. Yeah.
Thank you, Katja. I believe we have some time for questions and comments, but not much, I think.
And very important, the publication should come back because some of them are also from the library. Yeah, thank you.
Sure.
Thank you, Katja, for this very interesting presentation. My general question, I suppose, is on methodology, or on kind of like where is the difference between the level of analysis and the level of what we want to happen, in the sense that I think it's two different things. If we want to happen that a certain culture becomes multicultural, that's one thing, and then a different thing is just the level of analysis. So I'm just wondering, because of course you mentioned that Josip Osti had more recognition, at least in part, also because he was writing in Slovenian, and it happened with everyone else as well. My wife translated Velibor Čolić from French, not from Serbo-Croatian. There's, so many other authors who write in the languages of the dominant culture. So I'm just wondering, where do you situate your work here, methodologically?
Yeah.
In the sense, do you see yourself more on the side of analysis or more of the side
No,
of...
no, no. I'm definitely more on the side of analysis. So from the insights into these structures, I basically want, or my aim is to suggest a model how to understand the different aspects of these activities, and only basically sketch the possible kind of attachment points to the work of other researchers that basically develop very practical models how these production could be and should be integrated into not only the educational processes, but also in terms of programming, like who gets the chance to produce, for example, a theater performers, or to publish a work of literature. You must know that till 2 years ago, a membership in the Association of Slovenian Writers wasn't possible for writers who were not producing in the Slovenian language. And producing in Slovenian language was basically also, the condition for the scholarship, for residence, for inclusion, and even if they produce, and especially, even if they produce, and this is something that I also found out, very little, if before in Yugoslav framework, even, different children's literatures were still quite exclusionary. In terms of who they were publishing. One exception was Lastavica run by Ahmet Kromačić. This was truly a Yugoslav book edition. Other editions were basically publishing translated works more if they were really strictly in connection to curriculum. But magazines for children were more spaces where works were translated. And out of these magazines, basically also, and as I was tracing back, who was here to welcome their Bosnian Herzegovinian colleagues. These was basically writers and editors that themselves had experience of migration and that were editors of children's magazines that were more open towards translating. And nowadays, children magazines almost do not publish any of post-Yugoslav or even international children's literature. I mean, the magazine landscape really got less, but still also the editorial politics got very nationalized in the sense. But what I'm more interested, it's basically out of these three aspects that I sketched to you. So I point then in my contribution, I then point on the infrastructure, on the thematic, on the level of relations in production, on these three basically aspects, yeah.
Okay. We will take another question and I will just ask you for a shorter answer.
My question is also very short and pragmatic, but because you have a lot of expertise in this topic, I would like to know, because I was doing workshops in high schools and primary schools with teachers, with children, but with teachers especially, about how to teach about refugees and how to teach refugees themselves. And the issue was about the language, of course, as a very important part of homogenization of nation. And the issue was whether to, when people come, when children come, they don't know the dominant language and they cannot follow the other classes, basically, and they're worse in these classes because they cannot, if they're included immediately into the school program, they cannot follow because they don't know the language. And then the teachers came with the idea, with a model that is in Germany or in Netherlands, that first year you have just this pripravljanica, like you just learn the language, basically you are in school, but you are mostly learn the language so that you can then follow the other. But then there are some other researchers who think that this is like exclusionary and that children should be included as soon as possible. You know, my question is, from your research, what do you think is better for children themselves, for refugee children themselves?
Well, here I cannot really answer you like this. I can only state that in the 90s, how it was in the 90s, I mean, no, it's not true. I will state also my opinion on it. In the 90s, it was like this, that elementary school children were taught in special schools that were organized in so-called zbirni centri. Some of the schools, like Prežihov Voranc, had also classes, but they were taught in their own language. So basically this was also the possibility. So some of the authors that I worked with, they published also works with Ministry for Education. That was very much engaged at that time, but the high school children were integrated into the classes, the Slovenian classes. Now, I believe that that integration is important, but I also believe that this integration must be multi-language integration. So I think that if the curriculum would really reflect on who are these children, that basically in some parts of the program, not only the literature from, you know, and art, you know, from the context that these children come, should be reflected on and taught on, but also partly the languages in terms of, as you know, in spring this year, there was this proposal that, I mean, the majority of immigrant children in Slovenia, their mother tongues are of post-Yugoslav origin. And there was this initiative for the law that children could learn their language at schools, you know, and this did not go through. And I think this is a huge mistake, because all of the research in multilingualism shows that if the mother tongue is growing in multifunctional facets, then also the tongue in which the education or the tongue of environment is growing. So we really, and we are miles away. In Germany, for example, it's much more developed, still not enough, and still teachers really insist on, you know, like my son in Germany, his good note in German language was delivered to him by a teacher. Amazingly, how good you talk German, because at your home you don't talk German. Exactly because of it, because we took care of, you know, him being in contact with different aspects of his two mother tongues, basically. So this is, it's a lot of work is to be done, and I must say that media landscape on how they report on these issues, it's catastrophic. It's so nationalistic and so narrow-minded, and even though the researchers work, amazing work on it, this does not kind of
yeah. Okay, yeah, let's finish with catastrophic media landscape. I think these are important issues which also kind of pretty much address also the Damir Avdić theater piece we saw yesterday and we could see these days. And many other issues, and I'm sure that we will come back to multilingualism with Djordje for the last presentation. Yeah, so let's finish here. Thank you, Katja, so much.
Thank you.
Kind of running out of time.
Our next speaker is Damir Arsenijević. Damir is the professor of Anglo-American literature at the Faculty of Philosophy at the University of Tuzla in Bosnia and Herzegovina. He is many things. He is a theoretician of literature, a psychoanalyst, the artist, as well as one of the finest cultural studies scholars in the region, according to my modest opinion. He's the author of Forgotten Future, The Politics of Poetry in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and the editor of the Unbribable Bosnia and Herzegovina, The Fight for the Commons. Important part of his research, art, and social engagement currently concerns the field of ecological humanities and is done within the platform called Earth, Water, Air. His today talk, which I think is based on the research done together with Saša Arsenijević, is titled From Victim to Survivor, the realization value of survival in artistic practices and in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Damir, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Tanya. Thank you for your kind words. Bosnia and Herzegovina lives the terror of peace. The result of the 1992 to 1995 war in Bosnia and Herzegovina is this: hundreds of thousands of dead, hidden mass graves, the legacy of concentration camps and wartime rapes, a ruined country, and the theft of socially owned property by a new class of ethno-capitalists. The Dayton Peace Agreement, signed almost 30 years ago, may have ended the spectacular side of the wartime violence in this country. In its place, however, it ushered in the slow violence of an anti-social peace. The terror of this anti-social peace is a continuation of the production of people and social relations as waste, managing people as waste, constantly wasting lives and wasting environments in the rampant chase for profits. If this seems insufferable, the people of Bosnia and Herzegovina are given a false choice daily. You either accept the Dayton Peace Agreement or you risk another war. What is this if not a peace agreement as dead labour, both as that which thrives on our internal privatised conflict of guilt, shame and mistrust as survivors, and as that which taps into the dead and extracts value from them? This is the peace agreement that, vampire-like, only lives by sucking living labour. Have we survived the war only to be put back into circulation of capital and be pitted against one another in this trauma market? Rat ne počinje u istom trenutku ili istom danu, niti u istom mjestu za sve. Čardak. The war doesn't begin at the same moment, day or place for everyone. Amidst the anti-war protests in Bosnia in 1991 and 92, war becomes the master signifier that demands a subject be sewn to it. The start of the war represents the quilting point, the moment of attachment of the subject to this master signifier, a fantasy retroactively created. War demands acquiescence. It necessitates tacit acceptance as the master signifier begins to dominate everything, with little reprieve from its grip. This marks the moment of interpellation into war, a moment of a forced choice, live or die, when an individual responds to the violent eruption of the war by trying to survive, and in doing so disavows the possibility of the anti-war. In doing so, an individual becomes a mute bearer of guilt, retreating into the private and accepting the destruction of the social bond previously created by socialist Yugoslavia. There are also those who over-identify with the master signifier, the executioners, kings who really think they're kings. They materialize the fantasy of fascist continuity, forcing individuals into survival as the privatization of politics. Some reject the forced choice as false. They respond to the injunction to accept war or die with a firm no thank you, and instead focus on saving the lives of others. Sasha Asintić's individual performance within the exhibition retrospective from 2019, performed at the Hamburger Bahnhof in Berlin, is based on the experience of the residents of the Čardak settlement in Derventa during the spring of 1992, and explores how individuals behave towards each other when the existing social order collapses, shedding light on what the state of exception reveals about society itself. Thus, Sasha writes, I once sat with a neighbor in Derventa and asked him to tell me what happened to him in April 1992. Those of us who were lucky enough to escape, avoiding bullets, shrapnel and torture, only knew parts of the stories. But I had never heard them from those who weren't so fortunate to escape and who survived it all. I didn't know how to connect with them. I gathered the courage to ask and to listen, if he was willing to share with me. I told him I was an artist preparing a performance, mustering the courage to speak publicly for the first time about my life in the years leading up to my 15th birthday, and especially about that day when instead of celebrating, we fled our home, leaving a check cake on the table, realizing the war had begun. War doesn't start at the same moment, on the day, or the same place for everyone. For me, it began in the kitchen while looking at the cake. In our house, it had 3 other beginnings, one for my sister, my mother, and my father. There were 8 more beginnings for our first neighbors who left with us, many more beginnings further down the street, and one for my neighbor at the top of the hill, and countless others throughout Čardak and the whole of Derventa. War doesn't end on the same day or at the same moment for survivors. In many ways, it continues for a long time. I told my neighbor that I wanted to speak about the days when war was starting for us, and the years that followed when my mother could never make check cake again because it was too painful a reminder. I didn't want to be just another neighbor who only knew him through local newspaper reports about commemorations and sporadic updates on the fight for justice by the Camp Survivor Association. Nor did I want to see him through the lens that the neighborhood, steeped in ableism rooted in patriarchy and capitalism, had imposed, considering resilience, functionality, productivity and independence as the best for him individually and for the rest of the neighborhood, and this being the best support the neighborhood could offer. I wanted us to get to know each other, for him to know that I wanted to hear him. I remember watching my neighbor's large, rough fingers gently grasp the handle of his cup and his soft gaze as it passed over the still surface of his black coffee, falling through the table to somewhere far away whilst bringing the edge of the cup to his lips and taking a sip of coffee beneath his thick, unmoving moustache. I felt fear rising in me as my gaze was searching where my neighbor was. My neighbor whose fingers, lips, head, back, chest, stomach and genitals had endured the horrors he had just told me about surviving in the Hos torture camp. But he wasn't there in front of me. I wondered what it was like to be what you are not. I felt as if the person in front of me is at the same time a missing person. I thought about how you become who you are. The fear I felt came from what we were warned about as children. To be careful that no one steals us, that we don't disappear. And from what I later learned as a teenager, that people do become missing persons. My neighbor held the coffee in his mouth for a moment, swallowed it, and told me that it was important for the stories from our neighborhood to be heard because they are rarely talked about. They occasionally make it to the news, but they aren't told. And he said, so let them live through art. In 1987, I was preparing for a dance performance, my first one at 10 years old, with other kids from my classroom. We were preparing for a school performance for the day of the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, the country where I was born and I grew up. Every November 29th, we celebrated our country and its socialist revolution with performances on the big stage of the House of Yugoslav People's Army in Derventa, Saša's small hometown in northern Bosnia. That day, with our performance, we celebrated our country, our society, and our way of being together. Less than 5 years later, it would all disappear. Saša further writes, I decided to leave Novi Sad, Serbia, and moved then to Germany. Shortly after my arrival, I attended a theatre performance. There was a scene with a scream that sounded like a scream of human flesh. This scream triggered a memory of a story I knew but did not hear firsthand in April 1992. I was fortunate, along with my family, to escape a torture camp under very lucky circumstances. The torture camp was established in April 1992 in Derventa, my hometown, by HOS, the Croatian army, in the basement of the House of Yugoslav People's Army, the basement beneath the big stage where the school performance took place in 1987. What I'm about to share is a story about that scream that is still on hold and waiting to be heard. I know about it because my neighbor, who survived the torture camp, shared this testimony with me. I also know about it from seeing how Radojca Garić, one of the neighbors, recounted it for the camera for the local TV station. I would like to ask you to try to remember his name, as we often tend to forget names that are unfamiliar to our language or culture. His name is Radojca Garić, and his testimony goes like this. I was taken to the basement of the House of Yugoslav People's Army and brought into a room where other Serbian civilians lay beaten and unconscious on the floor. Then they took me to another room. The floor there was covered with broken glass and stones. They forced me to take off my shirt and lie down on the floor. 2 soldiers in Croatian army uniforms stood on my back, while 2 others on each side kicked me. Then they ordered me to crawl under their weight, my body pressing against the glass and stones. Afterward, they commanded me to stand up. When I did, I was cut and bleeding. They took me back to the common room where the beating continued. They were beating Blagoje Đuraš the most. Blagoje Đuraš would fall to the floor and they ordered me to lift him up, which I did at one point. Then a woman in a Croatian army uniform named Azra Basić approached Blagoje's body. She stabbed him in the neck and then slit his throat. Blagoje made a sound, a scream, still breathing and fighting for his life, making gurgling noises. Azra Basić then came to me, grabbed me by the hair and forced my head down to his neck, making me drink the blood from his wound as he struggled to breathe. We started today as ordinary people, strangers to each other, but the time we've spent together has created a shared memory. This memory will be different for each of us. I ask myself, with this memory, what do we carry with us? How are we with each other, or how would we be with each other in situations where the social order as we know it is challenged, broken and different from what we are used to? This is how Arsenijević ends this part of his performance. We see that witnessing evacuates and immigrates into art. Arsenijević frames this witnessing within the coordinates of the destruction of the social to focus on the violent tearing apart of the social bond that existed within Yugoslav socialism. It is precisely this social bond that is almost always overlooked in analyses at the expense of the fascination with the spectacular material destruction. Neka im svima na savjesti stoji riječ Maska. Concentration camps are factories for the production of the antisocial. Commemorations, as they are mainly done in Bosnia and Herzegovina, are mere dissemination events of the products of the camp. This is how the logic of the camp is operative in Bosnia and Herzegovina today. The product of the camp is a petrified, silenced, and ethnicized victim whose story of surviving and dying that such a survival entailed cannot be acknowledged within this new antisocial. In this sense, a survivor is also a missing person from our society. Now, if Arsenijević intervenes into artistic practice by bringing forward the witnessing of people produced as missing in perpetuity, Emir Hodžić directly intervenes in the commemoration in the city of Prijedor and in Maska. Hodžić is remembered as a lone figure, a witness in all of his solitude, standing in the main square in Prijedor, a white ribbon tied to his arm, a reference to how Muslims were forced to mark their houses and apartments in Prijedor in the spring of 1992. In 2012, on the 20th anniversary of Maska camp, the mayor of Prijedor banned associations of survivors also to commemorate 266 murdered women and children in that city. Emir Hodžić went and bought white plastic bags and decided to defy the ban. I interviewed Emir in 2015, and this is how he remembered it. I wanted to do something with my body, even though it was officially forbidden to commemorate. I had such rage inside me, but I didn't want to let that rage turn into something negative. I wanted it to drive me to action. I took the bag and went to the main square. I remembered approaching, seeing people walking around, living their lives. But what did Prijedor do to me? It made me a victim. No, not just a victim, it made me a second-class citizen, someone who had to fear for their life, constantly in danger, every second. It is a form of torture, knowing that at any moment someone could come and that it's entirely normal. It happens every day, every minute, and no one comes to help. No one will help. This initiated a chain of visits to other concentration camps where Serbs, Bosniaks and Croats were interned, and this took off as the International Dan Bijelih Traka, as we know it today. Now, Maska is a mining complex around 20 kilometers from Prijedor. During the spring and summer of 1992, around 6,000 inmates, mostly men, but there were 37 women, were tortured, raped or executed there. Now, Mittal Group owns the mining complex, where there are still hidden mass graves. In August 2012, the Republika Srpska authorities and the Mittal Group gave permission, finally, that a commemoration could take place within the mining complex. Former concentration camp inmates asked Emir, "How about a performance for Maska?" One of the inmates talked about the routine in the camp, things that happened every day, and decision was made to recreate one of the routines, a transport from the kitchen. This was a reference to how camp inmates were made to run towards the hangar. They had almost no time in the kitchen to slurp some beans, and if they lingered to try to eat a bit longer, whatever time was deemed to be longer by the torturers, they would be singled out and tortured. On 6th of August in 2012, the decision was made for Emir to play the role of a concentration camp guard. And this is how Emir describes the preparation. When we arrived for the official commemoration, we moved around secretly because no one knew what we were going to do. I approached people. It turned out most of them were former camp inmates. We told them we were going to do a performance here and asked if they wanted to be a part of it. I quickly explained, "I'm going to torture you. Your role is to experience what happened here. I will do to you what was done in this place." The people who were former detainees immediately, without hesitation, said, "Yes, yes, I'm in." Some younger people were like, "Who are you? What? I don't get it. Wait." They didn't understand anything. But the former prisoners, as soon as I asked for volunteers, instantly said, "Yes, let's go." Now, Emir not only issued orders to sit, get up, kneel, but this enactment of a torture repeated beatings, stealing of watches, removal of shoes. The apex of the enactment was to be the moment when an order would be given to run towards the kitchen, and then the command would follow, "Stop," and this would be the end of the role play. Emir says, "When I first shouted 'stop,' no one stopped. I screamed 'stop,' but still no one stopped. They just kept running into the kitchen. They kept running into the kitchen. I remember yelling 2-3 times, 'Stop!' and I followed after them. I think 5 or 6 of them had already rushed into the kitchen as if they were going to eat, going for the beans. Those people were going for the beans. What saved Emir from breaking down, in his own words, is that the former inmates started leaving the kitchen one after another, approached and hugged him and told him, "Hvala, hvala za ovo." Now I think of this performance as having the structure of a dream. Dreams occurring in traumatic neurosis have the characteristic of bringing the patient back into the situation of his accident, a situation from which he wakes up in another fright. And this is Freud beyond the pleasure principle. It is not the fright of the enactment of the torture, but waking from it in another fright, fright of the terror of peace, is what the trauma consists of. It is not just the confrontation with death, but the confrontation with survival, completely contingent and incomprehensible. Carruth talks about this in these terms. Repetition, in other words, is not simply the attempt to grasp that one has almost died, but more fundamentally and enigmatically, the very attempt to claim one's own survival. If history is to be understood as the history of a trauma, it is a history that is experienced as the endless attempt to assume one's survival as one's own. The partisan method. Komemoracija. Tvoje rebro je oba puta zaraslo. Jednom je puklo od stražareve čelične kugle, drugi put od ljubavnog stiska mojih nogu. Ljubim ti zaraslu sljepočnicu, živo meso ispod zarasle kože, ližem brazdu kojom je niz tvoja leđa klizila krv, ližem tvoju krv. Jedna lomljena noga je ostala kraća, ova noga koju noćas snažno stišćem svojim putenim butinama. Ova vrela glava u mojim rukama obrtala se nekad u ritmu stražareve neumorne pesnice. Kako je dobro što si živ, kako je ukusno tvoje živo meso. Na travi ni na betonu noćas nema nikog. Ležali ste na betonskom igralištu škole. Noćas ovdje nema nikog, samo ti i ja, nema cvijeća, nema sjećanja, u mikrofon, okrugao kao čelična kugla koja lomi rebra. Samo ja koja ljubim zaraslu kožu na zaraslom lomu i ti čije sjeme ovu pustu zemlju oplođava. Adisa Bašić. Commemoration. Your rib healed both times. One time it cracked from the guard's iron ball, the other time from the loving squeeze of my legs. I kiss your healed temple, the living flesh underneath the healed skin. I lick the hollow on your back, down which ran your blood. I lick your blood. One leg broken stayed shorter. This leg which I squeeze so hard tonight with my lustful thighs. This burning head in my hand spun once in the rhythm of the guard's tireless fist. How good it is that you are living. How tasty is your living flesh. On the grass and on concrete there is no one tonight. All of you lay on concrete in the school playground. There is no one here tonight, only you and me. No flowers, no recollections for the microphone, round as the iron ball that breaks the ribs. Only me kissing the healed skin on the healed bone, and you whose seed makes this wasteland fecund. We are no longer in an oppositional discourse in which the framework of action is either reduced to incredulity and shock caused by the intensity of violence or couched in a reactive defense against it. This is a partisan method which entails no distance in claiming even the right to the living flesh that survived the torture of both concentration camps and commemorations. In this claim, a different public is produced, one that mobilizes both the private and the public in order to insist on the social. For what good is the body of the lover who survived if he is immediately going to be put into circulation by bloodied capital. This partisan method aims at settling the conditions to realize the value of surviving through the pleasure of the sexual act. In the poem, the production and realization of value are united through the intimacy of the sexual act, in which making the wasteland fecund does not stand in opposition, but is constitutive of the new body economy which we collectively need to produce. The partisan method intervenes in this temporality by making the speaker of the poem and the lover-survivor as an ensemble. They become timely together. They are together at the same time and they coincide with one another. At stake in transforming the victim into the survivor is reuniting the survivor with his personal name, as opposed to reducing him to a mere anonymity of an ethnic identity. This method interrupts complicity in torture through commemoration and claims the space for mourning as the commons, belonging to everybody and nobody at the same time. This new economy of the body, ushered in by the partisan method, deals with a more normative regime of commemoration by claiming the right to the body of the survivor and by removing this body from the clutches of bloody capital and its claim to the right to control the production, realization and circulation of value. Such reclamation of the body is an intervention into the antisocial. At stake is the very sociality that needs to be reinvented and practiced collaboratively in order to interrupt the further extraction of value from victimhood and the further commodification of the victim under the dominant commemorative regimes. The question remains, how do we then consolidate and produce a new type of commemoration through which we interrupt the law of the mass grave? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Damir. It's not easy to now say anything, but let's open the floor for thoughts, comments, questions. Yeah, I think
it's really not easy to formulate.
It's not. It resonates in so many ways. I think it's also maybe not intuitively resonates what Katja was saying, what was bothering me, kind of, our easy embracement of multicultural model as such, and what it means at all, like having all these people living one next to each other, defined again only by the cages of ethnic identities and being able to be visible only through that. And I think that's one of the problems of the aftermath of everything that happened to all of us. And, okay.
There was a question over there first.
Yeah.
Thank you, Damir, so much.
Great.
Thank you, Damir, so much. I'm not sure that I have also voice now I have a smoke, something, after your presentation. Just physical experience also, but thank you so much for making so many important conceptual relations also between, modes of productions in terms of subjectivity production, but also in terms of capitalist modes of production. And I was thinking in terms of concept of survival, in terms of survivor, when we have a focus on a subject who survives, so we have someone who is a survivor, and then you have two options in the war, to survive or to die. But what we have when we have a process of the mode of living as a survival, so the material condition in which then you are not anymore more a survivor, but you're actually living a constant survival, day-to-day survival. This is how I maybe saw your lecture. So what about these two levels of process or structure-oriented and subject-oriented approach to survival? Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you for this question. I have a huge problem with surviving, and how survival has been co-opted, particularly within the regimes of international models of governance through transitional justice as they're carried out in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and how surviving has actually become the lesser option than living. So there is this expectation of humanitarianism that you are constantly reduced to making the ends meet. So, if you will, survivors, those of us who survived, are maybe perhaps the perfectly trained subjects of the market in which we are constantly used and know how to do the tightening of the belt, right? So this is my problem of survival, because it promotes the most horrifying for me thing that hides, and the ideological clutches of which are terrifying, and this is resilience, which I have deep animosity towards. So on the one, that's on the one hand, structurally perhaps. On the other hand, there is this deep need to call into life and into survival, to enable people to assume one's own survival, because they're deeply disabled in the sense they're maimed, socially maimed, because they are produced as victims, and they can only claim sometimes their socio-political and economic rights as victims, and they can only speak as victims and as nothing more. So what I really like about both Emir's intervention, Sasha's as well, but Emir's in particular, the reenactment of torture, and Adisa Basic's poem that opens up a new possibility to commemorate, to think about a sexual act as a mode of commemoration, of calling forth a victim into life, into assuming a position in which the victim can claim their own survival, is particularly interesting to me. And then, and only then, from that position, can we I think, try to figure out how to pierce through and perhaps put an end to an endless surviving. But then it's difficult not to be able to be in a survival mode if the terror of peace is something that is imposed on you daily. So that's the conundrum.
Thank you, Damir. This was crazy. I feel now my thank you being kind of like, you know, the person who already lived through the torture, and then thanking Emir for having the opportunity to relive it. I do think your comment here with regard to Freud's text on Beyond the Pleasure Principle is really clever, I think. I don't think I ever properly understood Freud's point there. But I think your critique of survivalism really makes sense here. I don't really have a question.
Well, thank you for the comment.
I don't have a question.
Any other question or non-question?
Thank you very much. I thank you also for the talk. I was crying. I took it very emotionally, but it's okay. But at the same time, I was thinking of something. For instance, you were talking about survival, and I was talking about the awakening of the dead as this absurd kind of goal for a theater. But I must admit that when I was working on this idea, I used this term partisan theater. I was thinking about partisan theater. And you introduced Damir's partisan method. I immediately revoked this connection because I thought it's not maybe a matter of survival, but also of those who survived, but also of those who are not survived. The commemoration that do not restore a social bond, but how to say, not reenact something in a way that is opposite to the torture of peace, what you call the torture of peace, the spectacle of alienated producing of value, of this commemoration where the dead and those who survive become like the objects of the production, the resources of the production of the symbolic value. Yes, I must also admit that from my talk has kept a part on the reference to Beyond the Pleasure Principle, where I wanted to speak about this repeating memories as an attempt to return to a point a little bit before the catastrophic moment itself, in order to somehow to undo it, to do it otherwise. You survive a certain catastrophe and then you return repeatedly to the moment just a little bit before, just to live through it differently. It's not my point, but it's Rebecca Comey's point on Freud's death drive, and its positive there's positive elements in it. It's not a question, but a comment where I wanted to say that there are a lot of resonance, for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I mean, I felt that's where you were going, actually, and I was looking for the Beyond the Pleasure Principle in your talk, and I could actually see it, and I saw it pretty much in what you described as presensing, aiming to presense. You said catastrophe or apocalypse, and not knowing what, and to which immediately there was an association for me of the great article by Alenka Zupancic about apocalypse being still boring, right? And what is this kind of courage of the hopeless in this sense? So those canaries for me were speaking of that.
Okay, maybe it's a good moment to conclude this. Thank you so much, Damir.
Thank you.
Last presentation, last but of course not least, will be Djordje Popović, who is Assistant Professor of South Slavic Studies in the Department of Slavic Languages and Literatures at the University of California, Berkeley. His research and teaching interests include 20th and 21st century South Slavic literature, Yugoslav modernism and state socialism, critical theory, and intellectual history. He is currently working on a book project concerned with the mutually constitutive relationship between homelessness as a cultural standpoint and statelessness as a political condition. Another important thing to mention about Djordje Popović is that he's a commissar of New Yugoslav Studies Association. Very important thing. So Djordje will present his talk. Talk's title is Post-Yugoslav Author in the House of Being. The floor is yours.
Thank you all for coming and for staying. I want to begin by thanking Gregor and Blaž for organizing this wonderful gathering over the last 2 days, Tanya for hosting our session, and then Lučka and the folks at Maska for the hospitality over the last 2 days. I'll read this afternoon from a piece that will come out in Gregor and Blaž's volume, The piece is called Post-Yugoslav Author in the House of Being, and is itself part of a larger project about two different tendencies that I see developing in post-Yugoslav literature. One that ontologizes alienation, and the other that sees in it a strictly social and historical process of separation. The part you will hear today is about a third or even less of the longer essay. I will stick to the script and will read for about 20 to 25 minutes. Before I begin, however, I wanted to say a couple of brief words about Aleksandar Hemon, the author who is at the center of my critique here. Aleksandar, or Sasha Hemon, is one of the best known and most prolific post-Yugoslav writers. Hemon was born in Sarajevo in 1964. He found himself in the US by chance when the war in Bosnia began in 1992. He stayed and soon began writing and publishing in English. He has since written numerous novels and collections of short stories, including Nowhere Man in 2002, The Lazarus Project in 2008, and The Book of My Lives in 2013. His works were shortlisted 3 times, I think, for the National Book Award. He's a MacArthur Genius and a recipient of numerous Guggenheim Pen and Penn's Ziebold Awards. So this is about as good as it gets in post-Yugoslav letters, and if you haven't had a chance to read Hemon, I would highly recommend it. Okay, now the essay. The version in Gregor and Blaž's volume begins with an epigraph, where I quote from the last couple of lines of an interview that Hemon gave to Timothy Boswell, managing editor of the journal called Studies in the Novel. The topic and the title of the interview referred to a disposition Hemon calls the audacity of despair. The epigraph is as follows, quote, "The audacity of hope results in people sacrificing their lives from some hapless utopian power-driven project. I don't do that. I prefer to write in despair." End of quote, and end of my epigraph. In March 2015, 20 years after he published his first story in English, Aleksandar Hemon sat for yet another interview in his adopted language. The conversation took place in a Texas college town where Hemon was in residence that year at an arts institute. As befits the genre of the literary interview, the conversation quickly turned to the question of the writer's relationship to his medium. The interviewer asked Hemon the following question, quote, "This year marks 2 decades that you've been writing in English, and with greater mastery and nuance than many who experience it as a first language. How would you describe your interaction with the language, and has that relationship changed for you over the last 20 years? End of quote. The context and the definite article make it clear that the question is about Hemon's interaction with a specific national language, the English language, and not about language in general as a system of communication or a privileged locus of untold theoretical trends of the last century. At first, Hemon does not provide the response his American readers have come to expect from the immigrant writer. This is the oft-repeated story about an accidental émigré who learns the language of his host nation by reading Nabokov and who roams the streets of nowhere as a tormented, low-wage immigrant flaneur until the immigrant interior begins to merge with the American exterior. These are more or less Hemon's words. Instead of the usual answer, expertly calibrated to register a degree of familiarity along with a dose of strangeness, Hemon offers another response, a brusque defense against a charge barely perceptible in the question he was asked. Quote, "I guess I'm now, and have been for a while, fully bilingual." End of quote. By the end of his second response, Hemon's annoyance becomes more palpable and his language more precise. Quote, "Operating in 2 or more languages," Hemon explains, "is not fully appreciated in terms of literature and in terms of sheer being in the world as it is. A condition he calls monolingual myopia prevents monolingual people from understanding that the world is changing in some fundamental ways, and that in this new world, quote, speaking with an accent or writing in a non-native language is not an impediment, but a great advantage, end quote. It would be a mistake to conclude here that its great advantage manifests itself solely in matters of craft, or, as the first editor to take up Hammond's work put it, in a kind of hyper-acute sense of the possibilities of English that a native speaker would necessarily have. Far more is at stake here, for Hammond seems to suggest that the world is not as it appears, and that a new phenomenological perspective to which the world as it is will reveal itself in all its complexity is available only to a bilingual mind. In other words, the advantage of writing in a non-native language is as much cognitive as it is linguistic for Hammond. Now, this may explain why Hammond believes that being, quote, pathologically bilingual is, quote, a privileged situation, but it does not help us understand how he gets there. How do we go from the issue of second language acquisition to psychology, epistemology, and even ontology? To what does the bilingual state of mind owe its superior perspective, and what new and more complex world is suddenly disclosed through the same? There is no indication here that a more fundamental reality is a developed reality, only that our access to it depends on some hidden capacity within second language to circumvent the same social and historical relations that have clouded the monolingual view of the world in the first place. This is not the first time Hammond has attempted to draw his readers' attention to the nexus between language acquisition, storytelling, and knowledge. In the longer version of this essay, I have an example here of his earlier position on this. I'm going to skip. Nor is this the first time in Western letters that an obvious observation about the significance of language to our species is treated as sacrosanct. So what then is different about this case? What possible advantage will focusing on foreign tongues and their acquisition bring to the homespun reification of language? Is it really possible that some latent power remains within languages, unknown to all linguistic idealism hitherto, and that the harnessing of this power in Hammond's peregrine prose will rid the world of whatever remaining fantasies it still has about constitutive subjectivity? In what follows, I will attempt to develop an affirmative answer to this question. I will show that Hammond thinks he has discovered just such power, not in any one language, native or adopted, but in an overlapping space created in between languages. Acquisition is a formal requirement in this scheme, a necessary condition for this overlapping to occur. Whatever is sedimented in national languages and thus acquired along with a foreign tongue matters little to Hammond. In fact, overlapping functions as a sieve through which the dregs of history are sifted out and memories are converted into stories. I argue that this conversion mechanism neither frees Hammond's stories from historical determination, nor does it reveal some new truth developed through narration. I think I'm reading a little bit slower than when I was practicing, so I'm going to skip a little bit more. Between the current trends in child psychology and the rise of nativism on the political right, Hammond's championing of inherent bilingual and bicultural advantages appears so sensible and so high-minded that one is almost willing to look past the initial confusion of pathology turned into privilege. As Hammond is eager to remind his readers, truth and courage matter in literature and in life and literature, and little seems to be more audacious or wise than making a virtue of necessity. Moreover, to someone trained in the field of comparative literature, with its long-standing commitment to reading in original languages, the value of multilingual competence is intuitive, even axiomatic. Not only are two languages better than one as a matter of simple arithmetic, acquisition of another language is said to lead to a better appreciation and deeper knowledge of the original language, which then enables a whole new approach to the second language, and so on, ad infinitum. A new type of reflective cognition is thus produced when language takes itself as its own subject of representation and thought. The bilingual author thus dramatizes his own relationship to language, not to flaunt his competence among the monolingual masses, but rather to demonstrate a hard-won certainty, a new epistemological foundation grounded in a language becoming aware of itself, a feat of romantic irony like no other. To mistake the effects of bilingualism for knowledge per se, becomes possible, I think, only when language is seen as a natural fact and a proxy for method. In other words, a whole series of methodological questions that a displaced bilingual author would have to ponder are instead met with one ready-made answer about a redemptive promise always already present within language. For example, under what conditions does a bilingual person acquire his or her second language? And how do these conditions affect the representational capacity of the new language? In Hammond's case, this clearly happens under duress, but this duress manifests itself only as an existential category, eventually elevated to the panacea of language. More broadly, is there a political economy to languages, a relationship of dominance among them, or do they, and the meaning expressed through them, circulate freely in some virtual and timeless space of linguistic and literary parity? Does it matter what the second language is in Hammond's scheme? Would the interplay between two languages, between the before and after displacement, be the same if the medium was not English? When we speak of an a priori content of forms, a problematic certainly known to the author who blurs the lines of genre and slips in and out of cultural norms in order to free the content of his stories from formal limitations. So when we speak of an a priori content of forms, shouldn't we extend this sense of confinement and historical determination to entire national languages and literary traditions? Isn't this even more necessary when the expressive idiom in question is not merely a vernacular language, but the triumphant global English, home to a peculiar kind of world literature assembled in American literary markets to affirm mostly metropolitan values? Take, for example, the following passage from the Audacity interview, where Hammond contrasts his own way of accessing the past to that of the nostalgic writers, whose obsession with entirely imaginary homelands or fantasy lands he had dismissed earlier as having fascist aspirations. The past, says Hammond, and I will quote now, is an interesting thing in terms of displacement because access to it becomes a crucial matter, imaginatively speaking, intellectually speaking. One of the drives for me, for Hammond, to acquire the English language, particularly the register of the English language that allows me to write, was related to the drive to engage with the past from a new situation, a new position. A new language would be less useful, he says, for retrieving the past or even preserving it. This is a slight directed at those the restorative agendas of the nostalgic authors. He continues, language is always personal, particularly for writers. Your words are loaded with emotional content from the fact that you probably have learned it from your mother or your family. But it also limits your choices. If your mother can always be present in your mother tongue, perhaps you might try speaking a language that allows for a greater freedom. So to convert and address these memories in a different language gives them a different value, gives them a different structure, gives you different access to them. They can be converted into something else, into stories. End of quote. We will eventually return to the question of conversion of memories into stories, but for now, since we're still dealing with the methodological presuppositions concealed within the creed of bilingualism, let us proceed at first only with what is obvious in the passage. that I just read. At stake here is the question of access, and specifically access to the past. Other people may think of this as a matter of historiography, but that describes only one of two alternate ways of relating to the past. In fact, history for Hammond is a totalizing scheme that induces systematic oblivion by erasing individual memories in the very act of their retrieval. Fortunately, a countervailing force capable of forestalling oblivion is also at play. As Hammond wrote elsewhere, the only way to remember what must be remembered is to tell the stories of lives that have been erased by the megalomaniac callousness of history. End quote. None of this is unusual or without theoretical or literary precedent. But in most other cases, so from Homer's Demodocus to Benjamin's Lesko, those who have commented on the power of storytelling did not mystify its medium in an effect to save it from the ravages of history. Hammond's foolproof solution of simply switching to another language, a language that just happens to allow for greater freedom from the limitations one inherent in history, appears to place an inordinate amount of trust in a formal maneuver that alone can keep restorative tendencies at bay and thus succeed where native or immanent approaches have failed. This, I would like to suggest, is a fantasy, a daring fantasy, far greater than that of an imaginary homeland, which in Hammond's case was an actually existing socialist state that to varying degrees of success housed those who did not find solace in the abstract accommodations of language. To be fair to Hammond, he is not proposing an escape from history, exempting oneself from or overcoming history, all fit under the same undifferentiated rubric of politico-theological transcendence that Hammond considers an essential folly of humanity and that he mocks relentlessly as a catastrophic and delusional hubris. What we are talking about here is not escaping, but outwitting of history through a formal conversion that promises freedom and maturity, a different value and a different structure, without a hint of irony or even awareness to the extent to which this freedom-yielding conversion is itself based on the inner historical and political logic of the language of free exchange, value-added transactions, and structural adjustments. A simpler way to say this is that the language that allows for a greater freedom also imposes certain social and historically determined limits that do not disappear simply by positing the existence of some overlapping space of conversion. In fact, a whole set of ideological conversions seems to precede Hammond's bilingual conversion, anticipating the shape that surviving memories will take in the new language and its book markets. Hammond's prose is thus as restorative as that of nostalgic writers. Hammond would of course categorically deny this analogy, and he would not be entirely wrong, for there is indeed an important difference between these two approaches. The difference is in the substance of the actual stasis that they're each trying to reinforce. It is important to note that in addition to attributing the meaning of his stories to the conversion process, Hammond appears to also believe that this conversion can reconstitute what history has destroyed. This is not an insignificant difference. If, as I have intimated above, the former is a matter of mystification, the latter is an example of hypothesizing of language. In both cases, one is dealing with magic, but first magic is that of misdirection, language conceals method, whereas the second magic is that of creating or making. To rephrase this one last time, the former creates an illusion, whereas the latter has an illusion of creating. To test this proposition, to see how Hammond's world is reconstituted, and more importantly, what it actually looks like upon restitution, I will place some of his assertions about the power of language side by side with those about various social and political formations. Hammond claims that within the realm of history, transcendental projects have been abysmal failures for thousands of years. History is replete with examples of this catastrophic yearning, these foolish fantasies of people willing themselves beyond history and beyond the limits of their humanity. Hammond's own examples run the gamut from millenarian religions to American political hubris. Hammond's own examples run the gamut from millenarian religions and American political hubris to state-building projects in the socialist East. One may find it strange that such widely divergent and even irreconcilable political projects are all set to attest to the existence of a single phenomenon, an overarching transcendental folly that people are doomed to suffer in history. But this is and it has been a standard analytical fare among those commenting on the socialist experiment for decades. Whether one claims that socialism failed because it too closely resembled its Western counterpart, or because it did not separate itself enough from religious or metaphysical teleology, these arguments are based on formal analogies and on the equivalence that's imposed on what may well be different contents in each of the formulations. In other words, not all teleologies serve the same end, nor do all binary oppositions contain the same antipode, to use the most common example of content that's routinely dismissed in toto due to its formal quality. In Hammond's case, this means that we best not dismiss all transcendental propositions simply because they appear to harbor the same fantasy of stepping across the fucking line, Hammond's colorful definition of transcendence, without first understanding what this line is, how it has come into existence, and what it delineates. This is not to say that there is not an a priori content to each form. I'm in agreement here with Lukács, who made this argument convincingly, both in terms of literary forms and later in terms of the commodity form. But to rest the case there would mean philosophically not to move past Kant's houses of ill repute, and politically not to allow for the possibility of change. In Marx's Hegelian analysis of revolution, it is precisely the asymmetry of content and form that produces change. There is another way to say this. Formalism has become the default logic today because it absolves its adherents from having to make political judgments between, in our case, two different types of transcendence or teleology. For example, formally, there may be no difference between a shining city on a hill and the dictatorship of the proletariat. Politically and historically, there is. More importantly, the formalist conceit has also made well-meaning critics and authors politically impotent by assuming that revolutionary change entails a formal break or a rupture in the commensurability of form. In a strange historical twist, those who have outright rejected the teleological form and the possibility of transcendence find themselves in a no less religious predicament of waiting for a messianic rapture, looking for salvation in other realms, or simply resigning themselves to suffer audaciously the limits of the naturally determined humanity. This bleak, fatalistic view of a world beyond redemption, a world in which various theoretical decrees about the end of metaphysics are extended into political doctrines against revolutionary zeal, a world in which projects of willing yourself beyond history have failed catastrophically. It is this world that in Hammond's work is contrasted to the realm of literature. I will mention some of the actual phrases Hammond uses to describe the promise and the potential of language and literature. Quote, "Literature is inherently democratic, as it is the way for everyone who can read to enter the vast field of everything that comes under humanity." End quote. Writing is also, quote, "an inherently democratic project, since you have to give everyone voice." End quote. This can lead to a liberation of the self, there was a quote too, in both, sorry, this can lead to, quote, liberation of the self, end quote, in both the reader and the writer, end quote, the erasure of borders between the self and the world. Furthermore, the, quote, inversion of historical hierarchies is inherent in literature and language. The list can go on, but I trust two things are sufficiently clear. Language and literature are assigned too many inherent qualities for someone skeptical about metaphysical naivete. And each of these inherent qualities is a political attribute denied to historical agents. In Hammond's own words, in literature, quote, people are contending or battling not only the limits of language, but the limits of humanity. Precisely what he advised them to forego in history. Literature is inherently democratic, whereas political and social formations and institutions are not, and this includes the socialist state of his youth. The ability of human beings to create collectively and through their labor is stripped from them and bestowed instead on the work of a displaced author writing in a foreign language. Democracy, equality, even humanity are understood to be merely semantic categories. Since their implementation in history is by definition a disaster, they comfortably assert themselves in the aesthetic realm. Thank you.
Thank you so much, George. This was also fun in so many ways. So are there any questions? May I once?
Yes,
maybe
for once.
No, I mean, I really enjoyed it, and also, like, it resonated so much. I think it also actually, although of course some of the things we heard today were not funny and were very kind of profound in very different ways, but I mean, I cannot help like bringing this very cosmopolitan, bilingual, whatever story of international literature success into more local realms of our own existence here, and especially in the place called, like, where, to his own homeland, more or less, where we have more or less the very same process of kind of insisting on purity at the first place, when it's not like we speak here in Slovenia about Serbo-Croatian still, which I really kind of like and enjoy so much. But of course, south of Slovenian borders, it becomes more complicated. And my impression is that it's not anymore a problem to speak Serbian in Zagreb or Croatian in Belgrade, as long as it's pure. We had a fellow at our institute who first, she is Lithuanian, studying in Bologna. First she went to study Croatian in Zagreb to some summer school or whatever, and then she came to Novi Sad to some language school while she was in Serbia, and she said, I'm sorry, but I first learned this language in Zagreb, and they said, there's no problem. You absolutely can speak Croatian as long as you don't mix. So I think that's actually a very important political moment which we are facing right now. And that's somehow my own persuasion that we can oppose this ethno-national democratic discourse of everything can be and everything is fine as long as you keep boxes clearly defined. The same is with multiculturalism. The same is with minority politics today in these lands and elsewhere. So I came to the conclusion that only mixing can somehow oppose this. Does it resonate somehow, anyhow, with the realm of literature and what you are like?
I mean, that's an excellent question, right? So it's no code switching when you're in Zagreb or Belgrade. You're welcome to this national literary or linguistic tradition or literary tradition, but as long as you stick to the borders. Of course, those who survey the borders of those national traditions are charlatans, right? I mean, they have done it in order to advance whatever arbitrary historical, political claims in any given moment they need it. So I mean, that's my favorite story. You know the names of 3 greatest Serbian authors of the 20th century? Ivo Andrić, Mehmet Meša Selimović, and Danilo Kiš. So okay. So the borders they set up arbitrarily, and now they want everybody to respect them. So not respecting them, you know, calling out their bluff, exposing the lie there is a homogeneous national tradition, exposing the lie that this language, Serbo-Croatian, exists in, you know, there are actually 4 languages, is in itself a political act here. But it's not a panacea, right? That is going to allow us to hit them back, but we'll have to do a lot more, right? So mixing in itself, I mean, this is from a United States perspective, right? From, you know, living in the United States where they're only, what is it, in the 60s, with the Supreme Court, Loving v. Virginia decision, allowed for mixed marriages, ethnically and racially mixed marriages, and then only recently allowed for mixed marriages between different genders. To allude back to a joke we had yesterday, from that, and they of course see that as they see that as a revolutionary, as a progressive thing. Well, remember what the former Yugoslavia was like, right? Coming from mixed marriages, whether it was the director you're talking about, or more or less most other folks we mentioned today, was not an exception to a rule. It was the rule, right? But that in itself didn't save us, right? It wasn't enough, right? It's enough to, as I said, expose the myths of this arbitrary affinities that are being imposed on us, but developing a historical consciousness, developing a political subjectivity takes a lot more.
For sure, but again, as you said, like, it's very important not to buy the narratives in which theologically we were all doomed to what happened to us because our socialism was not real and so on. I think it's also important not to kind of to insist on certain strategies that destabilize this unbearable peace in which we all live today. Yeah. Before I give the mic to Gregor, I have another question. To which extent you think the discussion, which I find really outrageously interesting, of like this total like stupidness of trying to transcend like this historical determinism of Hammond, to make it more simple, on one hand, and this idea that literature and language are so liberating and so can be potentially so transgressive and so on. To which extent actually it's a problem of dichotomy between the individual and the collective in very liberal ways of thinking about individuals as the only subjects of, you know, that can have agency of transgression.
That's an excellent question. I mean, that's exactly what it is. It's an expression. If an individual is the sole and sovereign subject, and one can only act individually, right? And there is no politics, right? There's only ethics left. And so maybe this is what that approach looks like in literature. And it's the communal community, it's the social that he's afraid of. It's when people come together and realize that these arbitrary historical social limitations are there to be transcended, right? Not to be respected, right? This is philosophically, this is a move from come to Hegel. I mean, this is something which we figured out 200 years ago, right? But so the limits are there to be transgressed, and that we can do that only together, right? Then you're dealing with politics. What I find really offensive about, I mean, a few things. First, he's very good. So if anybody means, you know, some of you may know him. I mean, he's actually a kind human being. From what I understand, I don't know him personally. He's an incredibly talented author. Those things I appreciate. What I find annoying is that he's never met a trend in literary and critical markers that he did not like. So that's a skill too, right? And the second thing is, when I hear him talk like this about transcendence, all I hear is his dismissal of the former Yugoslavia, the socialist Yugoslavia. Because if there's one thing that our grandparents proved, is that you can exactly step across the fucking line here, right? This is the place.
Not only you can, but the state collected infrastructures.
Yeah. But I'm returning to I'm actually talking about the partisan method, right? Mm-hmm. If there ever was an easy historical example of somebody rising above those, you know, social and historical limits, they mistake for natural, right? If there was ever an example of somebody doing what no one else did in Europe, it's NOB, right? It's World War II, the way that it played out in Yugoslavia. I mean, we come from the people who have once already negated the natural, so-called natural limitations of their humanity. And to come from that and be an heir to a tradition, right? And be the one who an entry point to post-Yugoslav culture, right? I've never taught a student that didn't like his prose, right? And espouse this is, I mean, it's a great betrayal.
I'll just quickly ask my question. So I really appreciated your ending, criticizing the bad Hegelianism, bad Heideggerianism, even. Very bad Heideggerianism. I mean, because I do defend Heidegger. There is proper Heideggerianism, but this is clearly bad Heideggerianism. I appreciated, you know, the critique of humanism. This is always going to, you know, tick my boxes. So, two things. One, why is it that we care what artists say outside of their art, about their art? I mean, this is very typical. It's probably typical for other nations as well. But when I listen to Slovenian sports people talk about their sports, it's just so profoundly ridiculous. Just kick the ball and shut up. And I think I'd say the same to artists. Like, just do your thing. Please don't talk about your art, because it's going to be very bad. So, could this be a case of just someone who doesn't really have a good theory of his own work? No, please, absolutely deny it, but I'm just wondering. And then second question is something that thank you for, Djordje's paper is excellent. He has much more Heidegger and Hegel and Adorno in it than he lets believe. But there's a comment that I made to you. There's an example of Beckett, who is bilingual in a very different sense, right? Who invents his French in order to reduce his openness to the language. You know, he wants to limit himself with this insane, stupid language of the French. So I wonder if you see any, you know, does that resonate in any way? I mean, it's a kind of a completely different, anti-Heideggerian, if you want, approach to language. Like, let's have less. let's just have less, a kind of reduction.
Yeah, so it's very interesting that Beckett never comes up, right? It's Nabokov, it's always Nabokov, right? It's knowing exactly the mold that you're gonna fit in. So it's this Cold War model of a dissident, ethical author subject, right? And the mold or the model already existed there, right? So that's the first thread that he knew how to met, and then he obviously supported. But Nabokov and then Brodsky in the United States also not the only models, right? Beckett is another one, but it doesn't come up. This gets complicated now, and it's part of the stuff I did not read today. But you will remember, because you read it before, he had this earlier understanding of what how to put it simply or quickly. There was a different theory of language that he's supplanting with this obsession with the interstitial, intersectional, hybridity, overlapping kind of a thing. And the earlier one, he came to it while observing a child at play, or a child creating an imaginary friend. And suddenly he has this epiphany of how both the child who goes through the language explosion and suddenly finds itself possessing too many words and too little experience, right? Has to create this narrative world, has to extend itself into this narrative world. It makes a parallel, an analogy between that phenomenon, which is universal, or at least a child acquiring language is universal, that phenomenon and the one of him writing. And so he says, I too, I'm just like full of words, I'm full of expressions, and I just don't have enough experience. So what I do, I create fictional characters, right? I externalize myself. I create somebody other than myself, and then my characters live these other existences. And through the lives of my characters, I get to understand something about myself that otherwise I wouldn't know. So in both of these cases, the axis is on the side of language, right? There's too much language and there is not enough experience. Well, in the left Hegelian tradition from which I come, it's exactly the opposite, right? I was hinting at that in a little bit of what I left, but that didn't really read that part. It is the concept that fails us, right? Not the experience, right? It's our concepts that can never appropriate the objects, and that is the failure, the drive. That's how you define the Hegel defines human experience. Well, with this switch from the conceptual to the linguistic, which he practices, but most of French theory practices by maybe badly reading Heidegger, right? When we go from conceptual, from a subject failing conceptually, right, to this linguistic turn, right? When we go through that linguistic turn, suddenly Beckett is not that interesting, because the problem is not, you know, it's a self-aggrandizing megalomaniac, selfish ultimately. I mean, I never thought of that, but this is exactly what it is. We're seeing an expression of radical individualism. Sorry.
Yeah, I wanted to attach directly to what you raised before, which was the question of language and mixing, but also the question of like the form and what is going on, or what happens in by writing, yeah. And it's my comment. It's more comment. It's going to be far less speculative. It's just that as I was previously
saying like that's bad.
I was previously looking at the conceptualizations of literary education in socialist Yugoslavia, where from Hammond basically came from, yeah, because the structures of literary education in socialist Yugoslavia were like really manifolded. There were so many, but the concept from the 50s on was something that Tanya also said. it was basically the synthesis of, it was very much importance laid into children not repeating, giving forms, but what is today very much enforced with childism, like, you know, the space of freedom. So basically, already in the discourses as how this education, literary education, was framed, there was very strong notion of literature being the realm of free subjectivation. Nevertheless, if you then compare like the motive level, it was quite descriptive in a sense of, you know, what kind of child was it possible in literature. So this is, I would say that this has also, as I said during my talk, that if we see in a continuum, for example, the politics of children's literature, we quite already see also very mononational editorial politics, and partly also language politics. It's just, you know, my observation, it's very important debates, but I think that, you know, these difficulties we are dealing today, you know, they also have their historical development. Just it was just a comment.
This is completely fascinating. It's this. I mean, it's an absolutely fascinating comment. It's good to. It's good to force us speculative Hegelians here to historicize things, and at times, but it gets to be even more complicated than that, because the model that I was earlier I was referring to Nabokov, etc., but the model of an immigrant writer and the model of a narrator that's available to an immigrant writer is going to be legible to foreign audiences is one of a plural child, right? So your immigration is understood as second childhood. You know, you learn the second language, and you go. That's why these analogies with the child's play or imaginary creation of imaginary friends come naturally to him. But this already exists, right? And you see it. It's even thematically treated in a lot of these immigrant works. Very quickly, and then we're going to go to Damir's question. You also asked about why listen to these authors when they give interviews, right? Well, this is, so something has, so you and I already talked about it, something has changed fundamentally how we, in literary criticism, since basically the Paris Review came out, they pioneered this notion of how we are going, against formalism, new formalism, we are now going to turn to authors themselves. They are going to be the ultimate authority. They're going to be the ones that we're going to listen to about their work. Their work now are not just novels and short stories. In Hammond's case, actually, generically very difficult things to describe. Some of these collections of short stories are not really short stories, right? He calls them true stories. They're stories about himself, right? My Parents is an example. The Book of My Lives is another example of that. So part of their output right now are not just novels and short stories. Part of what they're doing are these interviews as well. But the interviews, in addition to adding to their literary output, are also part of selling their work. So the sale of the work, the commodification of the work, is actually built into the form of it. And it gets even worse than that. They're actually now writing. They're not just. They're no more muses. They're inspiring them, like the British romantic poets or something like that. His muse, and this is the last Russian I'm going to shit on today. His muse is Svetlana Boym. It's the shitty literary theorist, basically bad Heideggerianism, the derivative Heideggerianism flashed through Svetlana Boym's the future of nostalgia that plays out here. So he's writing for the literary taste of the critics, and then the critics, in turn, are going through orgasms while reading this. So we can't actually think of this as literature anymore. It's something else. Okay, sorry.
Thank you so much. I mean, that's why it's so interesting that you didn't take Hammond to task when he claimed that he's full of language. I don't think he is. I mean, Hammond will never be Joyce, right? And I think that would be the aspiration. I mean, having too much language would lead to Joyce, being Joyce. But then I was also struck by there being at least two Hammonds. There is a Hammond who writes columns in Dani.
Hadani, absolutely, Hammond would.
And when you read that, and the thematic attitude towards society, right, and towards politics is completely different than what's in the novels. And then my second question or comment would be, do you think that Hammond's attitude to language is reflected in his characters, in his novels?
So the second one first, because it's a little bit easier, it absolutely is. Nowhere Man, his first novel. So the first book he publishes in English is a collection of short stories called The Question of Bruno. And then he publishes this novel, I think I mentioned, it's called Nowhere Man. It itself, it's not clear that it's generically a novel, right? It consists of these 6-7 parts that don't really come together. The narrator is very clearly not the same person when you start reading it. They come with different names and so on, until you realize that each one of these narrators is an alien and an externalized version of Alexander himself. So this essence that only has its being to be, right, plays out in that novel. And this last novel, The World, all that it holds, I don't know if that camera is on, but it's unreadable. In fact, I have it here. I tried to read it again. I thought to myself, I cannot be publicly talking about Hammond without having actually read it all the way through. So I tried it one more time.
Why did you not?
Because it became there's almost no craft left in it, right? He's just over the top. He's going to make a literary expression of exactly what I'm accusing here. So it's wonderful ammunition for me, but it's not a pleasant thing to read. What did you think about it?
Well, it was gimmick, but
yeah, that's exactly right. But he's not. He was better earlier. It wasn't obvious that what he was doing were gimmicks. This is.
What about the first part?
Yeah, remind me what was the first one I jumped.
Second.
Well, that goes back to what Tanya was asking. Yeah, there's almost two different politics. In a way, we all have it, right? We're waging different battles. We find ourselves waging different battles in two different historical and political contexts. So oftentimes the liberal positions here, right, are radical. Like, I don't know, the fact that is Lana still here, right? That somebody living in this country should have a right to become a Slovenian citizen and vote. That people cannot be erased from the registers, indices of citizenship. That to be a national of Serbia does not mean to be ethnically Serbian. His historical regression that these poor lands have gone through is remarkable, right? This puts us back to late 18th century, these are the tenets of the French Revolution. But those are radical positions here. Whereas over there, they're not, right? There he can, so that's why that his politics in Behardani can resonate as progressive, right? Whereas over there, what he's doing is, yeah, it's worse than mainstream. It's a false alternative, right? There's something. This is also the part that they cut out, but there's something dynamic about this fake Heideggerianism. There's something appealing about it. You're drawn to this not only for aesthetical purposes, but politically too. You really think you're sticking it to the man and the commodity and the commodity circulation by radical theory or producing this kind of so-called radical literature. So it's not, it's mainstream, it's a wrong prescription almost. I like him in Behardani. So he wrote, I don't think he does it anymore, I can't remember, but for a very, very, very long time he had a column in Behardani. And then he put all this together, and I think the column was even called Hemenwood. And then he put, he compiled all of this together. Yeah, I don't know if that is, I mean, how would you?
No, I'm just kind of thinking about what his attitude towards him being a writer instead of creation, because his writing career started in the 80s, right? And the way he wrote in magazines, and the way the split happens between the two languages in which he writes.
So I have a lot more on Hammond. It's actually going to be a chapter in this book. Then I'm writing. The split happens. So the first 2 or 3 stories that he wrote, including 2 that included in Question of Bruno, he actually wrote in Serbo-Croatian, and then he translated himself into English, and only then he started, once he was in Chicago, he actually started writing in English. To one of these stories, he added a footnote that he wrote in English. There's a story originally written in Serbo-Croatian and a footnote in English, and I said, that's the split, right there. You can see it written to different audiences. The stuff he wrote here, I mean, he has a fascinating Yugoslav prehistory. So he dabbled a little bit in writing, but he was really he had a radio show, and then what he's really well known for, and to his credit, he has attempted to deal with this in some of his prose. He was at that famous party where Isidora Bjelica was drawing swastikas on sandwiches in Sarajevo, which was understood as daring performance at that time. Of course, Isidora Bjelica, I think she's passed now, but that is, one of the doyens of Serbian fascism, as is
Okay.
Oh, okay. She's cutting us off. But we are among friends now. We can continue this conversation.
We can continue it over Zoom.
That's what I mean. Yeah.
So maybe we officially. No. I just want to officially finish this
session.
Of course, you will do everything else.